There is a country that remembers everything. It remembers the colour of its own moors, the shape of its own coastline, the weight of its own rain. It has kept those memories in stone and song, and the stubborn mouths of people who refused, across 1,000 years of occupation and burning and cultural erasure, to forget who they were. That country is Scotland. And yet, Scotland has a secret buried so deep that even most Scots do not fully know it. There are 400 years at the very beginning of this island's human story that have simply vanished. Not lost in the way that records get lost, not damaged the way that fires damage archives, not faded the way that ink fades on old parchment, gone, swallowed whole by time, as if someone reached into history and tore out the opening chapters of the book. The people who lived in Scotland during those 400 years left behind no writing we can read. They left behind no account of who they were or where they came from or what they believed or how they organized their world. They left behind a silence so complete and so strange that archaeologists and historians have spent generations arguing about whether they were really there at all in any meaningful civilizational sense, or whether Scotland in those centuries was simply waiting for the real story to begin. It was not waiting. The story had already begun. And what was happening in those 400 years, in the gap, in the darkness between the departure of Roman legions and the emergence of a recognizable Scottish culture, is one of the most haunting and least understood chapters in the history of any nation on earth. This is that story. This is an attempt to walk into that darkness and find out what was actually there. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and I find something almost impossibly moving about seeing them accumulate. Someone in Inverness at midnight, someone in Melbourne at sunrise, someone in a car outside a town whose name they have to look up to spell correctly. All of us gathered in the dark around the same questions about people who vanished before they could introduce themselves. Leave a comment if you feel like it. And if this kind of long, slow, careful history is something you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. Scotland before the Romans is a place that archaeology can only half illuminate. We know people were there. We know this with absolute certainty because they left things behind, the kinds of things that survive when nothing else does. Stones. Arranged stones, carved stones, stacked stones, stones dragged across landscapes at enormous human cost, to stand in patterns that still make people feel something when they encounter them in the early morning light. The people who moved those stones lived in Scotland for thousands of years before Rome ever looked north. They built structures that outlasted everything, that outlasted their languages and their gods and their names, and even the physical geography of the coastlines they walked along. At Callanays, on the Isle of Lewis, there is a stone circle laid out in the rough shape of a cross, older than the Egyptian pyramids, positioned in a way that has led some researchers to argue it tracked the movement of the moon across a 19-year cycle with a precision that required generations of careful observation to achieve. At Maeshowe in Orkney, there is a chambered tomb built 5,000 years ago, whose entrance passage aligns exactly with the winter solstice sunset, flooding the inner chamber with light for a few days around the shortest day of the year. These are not accidents. These are the products of minds that understood the sky, that cared about the relationship between human time and celestial time, that wanted to mark that relationship in stone that would outlast everything else. Those minds belong to people we have no name for. We call them Neolithic because that is the stage of tool technology they represent, but that label tells us nothing about what they called themselves, nothing about their languages or their stories or their understanding of death and rebirth and the turning of the year. They are the oldest layer of the Scottish mystery, and they are already unreachable. What happened to them is itself a mystery. Around 4,000 years ago, a new population began arriving in Britain, moving across Europe from the steppes of the East, carrying with them a package of innovations that included metalworking, a different approach to farming, and, critically, a different set of genes. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA analysis, which has transformed our understanding of prehistoric Europe in the last decade, shows something remarkable. The Neolithic population of Britain was largely replaced, not absorbed or blended, but substantially replaced, by these incoming people, who carried what geneticists call the Yamnaya ancestry, named for the burial mounds of the Pontic steppe, where this genetic signature was first identified. This replacement happened over centuries, rather than in a single dramatic event, and it was almost certainly accompanied by violence in some places, by disease in others, by economic and demographic pressures that we can read only in the bones and the DNA and the changing contents of burial chambers. The people who built Calais were diminished, displaced, absorbed into a new population that brought its own relationship with the land and the sky. And this process, this layering of one people onto another, this overwriting and absorption and partial survival of earlier ways into later forms, is the fundamental structure of Scottish prehistory. It happens again and again. Nothing is ever simply replaced. Everything becomes a mixture, a negotiation between the old and the new, with traces of the deepest layers surviving in unexpected places. The people who descended from that Bronze Age mixing, who lived in Scotland in the centuries before Rome looked north, are known to history by a name that Rome gave them, the Caledonians. The name appears in Roman sources as a catch-all term for the peoples north of what would eventually become the frontier line, and it probably never referred to a single unified ethnic or political group. The territory we now call Scotland was home to multiple tribal confederacies, speaking related but distinct languages, organized around kinship structures that differed from one region to the next, with their own local hierarchies and their own local sacred geographies. The Romans knew this, or at least suspected it, because their accounts of fighting in the north describe different groups in different areas, different tactics, different degrees of willingness to engage in pitched battle versus guerrilla warfare. The most famous single battle between Rome and the northern peoples happened at a place called Mons Graupius, somewhere in the northeast of Scotland, around the year 83 CE. The Roman general, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, claimed a decisive victory. His son-in-law Tacitus wrote an account of it that has survived, including a speech he attributes to the Caledonian leader Calgacus that is one of the great pieces of anti-colonial rhetoric in ancient literature, even if Tacitus almost certainly invented most of it. The speech ends with a phrase that has echoed down through centuries: "They make a desert, and they call it peace." Whether Calgacus actually said anything like this, we cannot know. What we know is that after Mons Graupius, Rome did not consolidate its control over the north. The legions pulled back. The conquest of Caledonia that Agricola seemed to have initiated was quietly abandoned. And then, over the following decades and centuries, something happened in those 400 years that Rome's presence in the south could not see and did not record. To understand the 400 years of silence, you need to understand what Rome's presence in Britain actually meant for the territories it touched and the territories it did not. Rome built roads, walls, towns, administrative structures, legal systems, and above all, a writing culture that has given historians an enormous amount of material to work with when studying Roman Britain. Every inscription on a Roman altar stone, every military diploma, every tax record scratched onto a wooden tablet, every letter from a soldier to his family preserved by the dry conditions of a well. All of this constitutes a documentary record that lets historians reconstruct Roman Britain in remarkable detail. The northern frontier, Hadrian's Wall, and then the shorter-lived Antonine Wall further north, was not just a military barrier. It was the edge of the documentary world. On one side of that line, things were written down. On the other side, they were not. And when the Romans eventually left Britain entirely in the early 5th century CE, withdrawing their legions to deal with crises elsewhere in the empire, the documentary darkness that had always existed north of the wall swallowed the south as well. Britain as a whole entered what used to be called the Dark Ages, a term that historians now largely reject as misleading, but that does capture something real about the evidentiary situation. We have dramatically less written material for the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries than we have for the preceding Roman period, and what we do have is fragmentary, contested, and often filtered through later monastic scribal traditions that had their own agendas and their own errors. For Scotland, this darkness is even more profound. The north was never part of the Roman documentary world in the first place. When Rome left, Scotland did not lose something it had possessed. Scotland's 400 years of silence is the silence of a world that wrote itself in materials that did not survive, or that did not write itself at all in the sense that we recognize. What we are left with is archaeology, genetics, the testimony of names on the landscape, and the scraps of information that appear in texts written by people who were not there, who were writing about the north from a distance, who were often more interested in making theological or political points than in providing accurate ethnographic description. It is from these scraps that historians have tried to reconstruct the 400 years. And what they have reconstructed, imperfectly, provisionally, with enormous argument at every step, is a story that is far stranger and more interesting than the blank that the silence might suggest. The people who would eventually be called the Picts emerge into historical visibility in the early 4th century CE, when Roman sources begin referring to a new confederation of northern peoples under that name. The word Picti appears in Latin texts for the first time around 297 CE in a panegyric celebrating the Roman Emperor Constantius Chlorus, who campaigned in Britain that year. The panegyric describes him fighting against Caledonians and other Picts, which is an interesting formulation, suggesting that the Romans saw the Picts as related to but distinct from the earlier Caledonians, or possibly just using the two names interchangeably in a way that reflects Roman confusion about the political organization of the North rather than any real distinction between groups. What the name Picti means is itself disputed. The most common interpretation is that it means the painted or tattooed people, from the Latin verb pingere, and this explanation has become so embedded in popular accounts of the Picts that it is very difficult to dislodge, even when scholars point out that the evidence for Pictish tattooing is thin and that the name might have had an entirely different origin, possibly being a Latinization of an existing native name, possibly being a Roman administrative label applied to a confederation that only came into existence in response to Roman pressure. Empires have a way of creating the categories they then use to describe and fight. The very act of building a frontier creates a unified enemy out of what had been a diverse collection of neighboring groups. The Picts, who appear in the historical record by the 4th century, were the inheritors of everything that had come before in the north. The Bronze Age mixing of Neolithic and steppe ancestry, the Iron Age tribal culture that resisted Rome, the accumulated traditions of a landscape-reading people who had been working out how to live in one of the most demanding environments in northwestern Europe for more than 5,000 years. They were not newcomers. They were not invaders. They were the long continuity of northern Britain, expressing itself in a new political form that the stresses of the Roman frontier had helped create. And they were doing something extraordinary, something that has puzzled scholars since it was first systematically studied in the 19th century. They were carving stones. The Pictish symbol stones are among the most enigmatic objects in all of European archaeology. They are found across a specific geographic territory: northeastern Scotland, the area north of the Firth of Forth, and east of the great mountain spine of the Highlands, with concentrations in Angus, Aberdeenshire, Ross and Cromarty, and in the far north, including Orkney and Shetland. There are over 200 of them. They date from roughly the 5th century through the 9th or 10th century, spanning the entire period of Pictish cultural florescence and decline. And they are covered with symbols whose meaning remains, despite more than a century of serious scholarly attention, substantially unknown. Not completely unknown, we can identify recurring motifs: the double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and V-rod, the serpent, the mirror, the comb, the eagle, the salmon, the stag, various animals, both naturalistic and fantastical. We know these symbols were meaningful because they appear again and again across a wide geographic area in consistent combinations, which means they were part of a shared visual language that everyone in Pictish territory understood. We know they marked important places and important people. We know, from the later symbol stones that incorporate Christian crosses, that they continued to be used after the Picts converted to Christianity, which means the symbols were not exclusively pagan in their meaning or their application. But what the individual symbols meant, what the combinations meant, what information a Pictish person standing before one of these stones in the 7th century would have read from its carved surface, we do not know. The code has not been broken. Some scholars have suggested the symbols represent a system of heraldic identification marking the lineages of the people commemorated on the stones. Others have argued they represent a proto-writing system, a way of recording information that worked through a different visual logic than alphabetic writing. Others still have suggested they represent cosmological concepts, elements of a religious worldview that we can only glimpse through the fragmentary evidence of later Christian conversion. None of these theories has achieved consensus. The Pictish symbols stand in their fields and on their hilltops, carved into sandstone and granite by hands that knew exactly what they were saying, speaking to any of us who might listen in a language we have entirely lost. This is the first great mystery of the 400 years. The Picts were clearly a sophisticated, organized, culturally rich people. They built promontory forts and souterrains, underground stone-lined passages that may have served as food storage, refuge, or both. They produced metalwork of extraordinary quality, including objects like the Hunterston brooch and the great silver hoard found at Norrie's Law in Fife, which contains pieces of Pictish silver, decorated with symbols that speak to a craft tradition of genuine accomplishment. They had kings, a royal dynasty that maintained itself across centuries, at times powerful enough to defeat Viking forces that were simultaneously devastating kingdoms throughout the rest of Britain and Ireland. They fought the Northumbrian Angles at Nectansmere in 685 CE and inflicted a defeat so decisive that it effectively ended Anglian expansion northward and determined, at least in broad outline, where the future border between England and Scotland would lie. They were, in short, a real and substantial civilization, and they left behind almost no writing in their own language. Almost. There are a small number of Ogham inscriptions in what appears to be the Pictish language, but they are brief, damaged, and so poorly understood that scholars cannot agree on what they say. There is no Pictish epic poem. There is no Pictish king list written in the Pictish language, though there are king lists written in Latin by later scribes who were working from earlier records and who may have introduced errors in transcription. There is no Pictish account of their own origin, or their own beliefs, or their own understanding of what it meant to be Pictish. The 400 years of silence, and everything that came after, is a silence in the deepest sense, not just an absence of survival, but possibly an absence of production in a form that could survive. Why? Why did a people sophisticated enough to produce the symbol stones and the great silver hoards and the military victories over Angles and Vikings not produce a written literature? This question sits at the heart of the mystery, and the answers that historians have proposed tell us as much about what we do not understand as about what we do. One possibility is that the Picts used a writing system that was perishable, scratched onto wood or waxed tablets or animal skin that did not survive. Many Iron Age and early medieval cultures across northern Europe used writing materials that have left no trace. Another possibility is that Pictish literacy was restricted to specialists, perhaps Druids or their successors in some form of pre-Christian religious structure, and that the knowledge of writing was deliberately not shared with a broader population. This would fit with what we know about pre-Christian Celtic religious traditions in general, where oral transmission of knowledge was considered not just adequate, but actually superior to writing, on the grounds that things written down could be read by the uninitiated, and that the discipline of memorization itself was part of the sacred process. A third possibility is that the Picts did produce written texts, but that they were systematically destroyed by the Viking raids that devastated monasteries and presumably secular cultural centres as well, by the gradual suppression of Pictish cultural identity that came with the merger of the Pictish and Scottish kingdoms in the 9th century, by the simple passage of time and the reluctance of later institutions to preserve records that referred to a superseded political and cultural order. All of these possibilities may contain partial truth. What is certain is that the silence is real, and that it forces us to read the Picts through the eyes of their neighbours and enemies, which is an inherently distorting process. The Irish annals mention the Picts, usually in the context of battles and raids, and the deaths of kings. The Northumbrian Bede, writing in the early 8th century, includes an account of Pictish origins that is partly mythological and certainly shaped by his own theological concerns. Later Scottish chronicles, written after the Pictish kingdom had been absorbed into the kingdom of Alba, refer to the Picts in ways that reflect a political need to establish continuity and legitimacy for the new kingdom, rather than an ethnographic interest in the old one. None of these sources gives us the Picts themselves. None of them lets us hear what the people who carved those extraordinary symbols on those extraordinary stones thought about their own history or their own identity. The stones speak, and we cannot understand them. The people who made them are gone and left no other voice. But they were there. That is the thing that the silence can make you forget. They were there in those 400 years and in the centuries before and after. Real people, with real lives of tremendous complexity and texture, living in a landscape that they understood with an intimacy that is almost impossible for us to imagine, organized in ways that worked for them across centuries, producing art of genuine power and beauty, fighting battles whose outcomes shaped the political geography of a country that still exists. The absence of their written voice is not an absence of their presence, it is an absence of our ability to hear them. And that distinction matters enormously, because it shifts the question from what happened to them to what happened to the evidence, which turns out to be a much more interesting and answerable question. The 400 years of silence, roughly from the departure of Roman administrative power in the early 5th century to the emergence of the first substantial native Scottish documentary sources in the 9th century, is not actually a single uniform darkness. It is a series of overlapping puzzles, each with its own partial illumination. There is the puzzle of the Picts themselves, who they were, where they came from, what language they spoke, and where they went when the Pictish kingdom ceased to exist as a political entity in the 9th century. There is the puzzle of the Scots, the Gaelic-speaking people from Ireland whose kingdom of Dal Riata straddled the narrow sea between Antrim and Argyll from around the 6th century onward, and whose cultural and political expansion would eventually give their name to the whole country. There is the puzzle of the Britons of Strathclyde, the heirs of a pre-Roman and Romano-British cultural tradition who maintained a kingdom centred on the great rock of Dumbarton for centuries after the Romans left, speaking a language ancestral to modern Welsh, clinging to a political identity that Rome had touched and shaped. And there is the puzzle of the Angles, the Germanic settlers who moved into the southeast of what is now Scotland from their kingdom of Northumbria, bringing with them a language that would become the linguistic foundation of lowland Scots, leaving behind place names and village patterns and a gene pool contribution that modern genetic analysis is still trying to fully characterize. 4 peoples, 4 languages, 4 different relationships with the landscape and with each other, all of them inhabiting the same territory simultaneously, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in alliance, sometimes intermarrying and absorbing and being absorbed. This is the real Scotland of the 400 years. Not a darkness, a complexity. Start with the Scots, because they are the ones who gave their name to everything that came after, and because their story is itself full of puzzles that the silence makes difficult to resolve. The Scots were not originally from Scotland. This is a fact so counterintuitive that it requires some sitting with, because the name Scotland comes from the Scots. And yet the Scots, when they first appear in historical sources, are identified as an Irish people, inhabitants of the northern part of the island we now call Ireland, speaking a form of Gaelic that was part of the broad continuum of Celtic languages that stretched from Iberia to Anatolia before the Roman expansion, compressed and eventually largely eliminated that linguistic world, everywhere south of Britain and Ireland. The name Scoti appears in Roman sources as early as the 4th century, used to describe raiders who came across the water from Ireland to attack the western coasts of Britain. The Romans did not seem to regard this as particularly surprising or unusual, because the sea crossing between northeastern Ireland and southwestern Scotland is extraordinarily short, a matter of roughly 13 miles at the narrowest point between the Mull of Kintyre and the Antrim coast, and the exchange of peoples, goods, and cultural influences across that water had been continuous for millennia before anyone thought to give the people doing the crossing a name that would eventually become the name of a country. The kingdom of Dal Riata, which is the political entity that historians generally treat as the origin point of the Scottish cultural tradition, was a kingdom that straddled the water rather than being defined by it. It included territory in what is now County Antrim in northeastern Ireland and territory in what is now Argyll in southwestern Scotland, and for most of its early existence, it was probably more natural to think of it as an Irish kingdom with a Scottish appendage than as a Scottish kingdom with Irish connections, simply because the centre of power and the centre of population were on the Irish side. The Scottish portion of Dal Riata, the region called in later sources Dal Riata in Alba, was a frontier territory, valuable for its harbours and its access to the fishing grounds and trading routes of the Western Sea, but not yet the political or cultural centre. That shift, the shift from Argyll as Irish periphery to Argyll as the core of something distinctly Scottish, is one of the central transformations of the 400 years, and like most of what happened in those centuries, it happened without being adequately documented. What we can reconstruct, imperfectly, is that by the 6th century CE, the Scottish portion of Dalriata was a real and substantial political entity, with its own king, its own warrior aristocracy, its own system of tribute and obligation, and its own relationship with the powerful Pictish kingdoms to its north and east. The Dalriatans were Gaelic speakers, in a territory that was otherwise, as far as we can tell, occupied by Pictish speakers, and this linguistic frontier must have shaped everything about their political relationships, their marriage alliances, their trade, and their cultural self-understanding. We know from later sources that intermarriage between Dalriatan and Pictish aristocracies occurred, and this matters for reasons that go beyond the merely personal, because the Pictish system of succession, which appears from the evidence of the king lists to have operated through the female line in some form, would have given the sons of Pictish women and Dalriatan fathers a claim to Pictish kingship that would eventually have profound political consequences. The figure who emerges from this world with the greatest historical visibility is not a king but a monk, and not even the most powerful monk of his time, but perhaps the most influential single individual in the history of the 400 years. Columcille, known to later tradition in his Latinized form as Saint Columba, was born in Ireland in 521 CE into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the country, a family with legitimate claims to the high kingship of Ireland itself. His decision to become a monk rather than a warrior king was not, in the 6th century Irish context, a rejection of the world of power and politics. It was an entry into that world through a different door. The early Irish church was embedded in the structures of aristocratic kinship in ways that would have been thoroughly recognizable to any Roman administrator familiar with the role of the senatorial class in late imperial religious institutions. Abbots were often members of the founding family of a monastery. Churches and monasteries functioned as nodes in networks of obligation, protection, and patronage that were indistinguishable in their logic from the secular, aristocratic networks that surrounded them. To be an important abbot in 6th century Ireland was to be a political figure of the first rank. Columba founded monasteries in Ireland before he left for Scotland, and the tradition preserved in his biography, written by a Domnan of Iona a century after his death, is that he left Ireland under a cloud, possibly exiled following a battle at Culdrimna in 561 CE, that may have been connected to a dispute over the copying of a psalter that Columba had made without the permission of its original owner. The story is complicated and probably mythologized, but what matters is that Columba arrived in Scotland, specifically on the small island of Iona, off the southwest coast of the larger island of Mull in 563 CE, and that he established there a monastery that would become one of the most important centers of Christian culture in the early medieval world. Iona is a place of extraordinary physical beauty and of almost unsettling spiritual intensity, a small island of perhaps 1,000 acres separated from Mull by a narrow and frequently treacherous sound, its western shore facing directly into the Atlantic. Its landscape of machair and exposed rock, and the particular quality of light that comes from proximity to the sea, giving it a character that visitors across 15 centuries have consistently found unlike anywhere else. Whatever Columba found there when he arrived, whatever the island's prior history, he recognized something in it that made it the right place for what he wanted to build. What he built was extraordinary. Iona, under Columba and his successors, became the mother church for the conversion of the Picts, the spiritual heart of Dalriata, and eventually the base from which the mission to the pagan Angles of Northumbria was launched, a mission whose product was the foundation of Lindisfarne and the subsequent conversion of much of northern England. The Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the supreme artistic achievements of early medieval Europe, represent the confluence of Ionan's spiritual and artistic tradition with Northumbrian resources and skill. The Book of Kells, produced somewhere in the Columban monastic network, possibly at Iona itself before Viking raids made the island too dangerous, is another product of this tradition. A manuscript of the four Gospels, decorated with interlace and zoomorphic patterns and human figures of such complexity and such beauty that modern graphic designers still use it as a reference point for what human hands can achieve. These are the products of the 400 years. Not silence, not darkness. An extraordinary flowering of visual and textual culture, produced by communities of scholars and artists who understood themselves as inheritors of both the ancient learning of the Mediterranean world, transmitted through the Latin Church, and the native traditions of the Celtic-speaking North, and who found ways to blend these inheritances into something entirely new and entirely their own. But Iona and its daughter houses were not Pictish. They were Gaelic. The Columban Church spread through Pictland and over time converted most of the Pictish aristocracy to Christianity, but it did so in a language, Latin and Gaelic, that was not Pictish. This matters because one of the enduring mysteries of the 400 years is what happened to the Pictish language. We know it existed because the Ogham inscriptions, the personal names in the king lists, and scattered words and phrases preserved in place names all point to a language that was Celtic but distinct from both Gaelic and the Brittonic languages spoken by the Strathclyde Britons. Scholars have debated for generations whether Pictish was a P-Celtic language related to Welsh and Brittonic, or a Q-Celtic language related to Gaelic, or whether it might have preserved elements of a pre-Celtic substratum, some older linguistic layer from before the Celtic languages arrived in Britain. The truth is that we have far too little evidence to answer this question definitively. What we do know is that by the 10th and 11th centuries, Pictish had ceased to be spoken anywhere. It had disappeared. The language of the people who carved the symbol stones and built the souterrains and fought the Angles at Nectansmere and maintained a kingdom across several centuries of warfare and political turbulence had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. How does a language disappear? Not all at once, not through any single event. Language death, which is something that has happened many times in human history and is happening right now to dozens of languages around the world, is a gradual process in which the functional domains of a language are one by one taken over by a more prestigious or more useful alternative, until the original language survives only in a few domains, usually the domestic and the informal, and then finally disappears from those as well when the last generation of speakers dies without passing the language on to their children. In the case of Pictish, the most likely agent of replacement was Gaelic, which arrived with the Dalriatan expansion, was reinforced by the Columban Church and its Gaelic-speaking monastic culture, and was probably already the language of the most powerful political and religious institutions in the territory by the time the formal merger of the Pictish or Scottish kingdoms occurred in the 9th century. A Pictish aristocrat who wanted to participate in the most prestigious cultural and political networks available would have needed to speak Gaelic. A Pictish farmer or craftsperson whose lord now spoke Gaelic, whose church conducted its services in Latin but was administered in Gaelic, whose trading partners increasingly came from a Gaelic cultural world, would have had powerful incentives to shift to Gaelic as well. Over 2 or 3 generations, the shift could have been complete, without anyone making a deliberate decision to abandon a language. Languages do not die because people decide to kill them, usually. They die because circumstances change in ways that make the new language more useful for more purposes, and because children, who always adapt to the language most useful for their futures, stop learning the old one. The Britons of Strathclyde represent a different and equally haunting thread in the 400 years. Where the Picts are mysterious because of their symbols and their vanished language, the Britons are haunting because they are recognizable in a way the Picts are not, and because their story is one of long, slow diminishment rather than the relatively sudden political transformation that ended the Pictish kingdom. The Britons of the north were the heirs of the pre-Roman Celtic culture of Britain, speaking an ancestor of the language that would become Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. They had been touched by Rome in a way that the Picts had not. The southern portion of their territory, the area around what is now Edinburgh, had been within the Roman province at various points, and the culture of the Votadini, the tribe associated with that area, shows clear evidence of Roman influence in its material culture. The great fortress of Din Idin, on the rock where Edinburgh Castle now stands, was a centre of Votadinian power, before it became the centre of the Anglian kingdom of Bernicia and then the fortress of a Scottish king. Its name survives in the name Edinburgh, a linguistic palimpsest in which the old Brittonic din, meaning fortress, is preserved inside the Anglian and later Scottish English form of the name. The kingdom of Strathclyde, which consolidated around the impregnable rock of Dumbarton at the mouth of the River Clyde, maintained its independence through the full span of the 400 years and considerably beyond. Its kings fought against Angles and Vikings and Picts and Scots with varying success. The rock of Dumbarton called Alcluith in the Brittonic language, meaning Rock of the Clyde, was sacked by a Viking fleet in 870 CE after a 4-month siege, an event recorded in the Irish annals, in terms that make clear it was considered a catastrophe of major significance. The Vikings carried off enormous quantities of plunder and a great number of slaves from the wreck of the Strathclyde Kingdom's heartland. Yet Strathclyde recovered even from this disaster, continuing as a recognizable political entity into the 11th century, when it was finally absorbed into the expanding Kingdom of Alba. The Brittonic language of Strathclyde survived even longer in some form. There are records from the 12th century of a language being spoken in Cumbria, the region that straddled the modern English-Scottish border, that appears to be a late descendant of the Strathclyde Brittonic, and some researchers have argued that traces of this language survived even longer in rural communities that never fully shifted to either English or Gaelic. Today, beyond place names, nothing survives. The Cumbric language, as scholars call the Brittonic of the North, is extinct, its last speakers dead centuries ago, their words preserved only in the landscape they named. There is something almost unbearably melancholy about the place names. They are everywhere in Scotland, and they are in multiple languages, and each layer of naming reflects a different moment in the long process of population and cultural change that the 400 years represents. The Gaelic place names are the most numerous in the Highlands and the West. Ben, meaning peak, Loch, meaning lake, Glen, meaning valley, Kin and Kin variants meaning head or headland, Bal meaning settlement, Dun meaning fort. The Brittonic names survive in Strath, meaning valley, and in elements like Aber, meaning river mouth, which appears in Aberdeen and Aberfoyle, and a dozen other place names in the east, where Brittonic was spoken before Gaelic arrived. The Anglian names dominate in the southeast, Tun, meaning farm, Ham, meaning home, Worth, meaning enclosure, surviving in Haddington and Coldingham and Howick. The Old Norse names of the Viking settlers cluster in the north and west. I and a meaning island, Wick meaning bay, Dale meaning valley, surviving in Orkney and Stornoway, and Lochbroom and Caithness, that last name itself being a Norse construction, meaning headland of the Cath. The Cath being a Pictish or Gaelic tribal name that was already old when the Norse arrived to overwrite it with their own linguistic layer. Reading the place names of Scotland is like reading a geological cross-section, each layer deposited by different people at different times, with the oldest layers sometimes visible only in the deepest valleys or the most remote headlands where the later deposits did not reach or did not fully cover what came before. The genetic evidence adds another dimension to this already complex picture, and it is a dimension that has only become fully legible in the last decade or so, as the technology for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from archaeological remains has become sufficiently refined to permit systematic study of prehistoric and early historic populations. What the genetic evidence shows, in broad outline, is that the population of Scotland today reflects all of the historical layers that the place names and the archaeology suggest. A deep substrate of ancestry going back to the earliest post-glacial settlers, overwritten and augmented by Bronze Age steppe ancestry migrants, further modified by later movements of people including the Dalriatan Gaels, the Anglian settlers, and the Norse. The Pictish genetic signature is more difficult to isolate precisely because the Picts were not a separate population in the biological sense. They were the indigenous inhabitants of northern Britain who carried the mixed ancestry of all the earlier population movements, and their descendants did not disappear when the Pictish kingdom ceased to exist. They continued to live in northeastern Scotland and to pass their genes forward into the modern population. When researchers today look at the genetics of people from Aberdeenshire or Angus, they are looking in part at the biological descendants of the people who carved the symbol stones. The stone carvers are gone as a cultural identity. As a biological reality, they are still there. This is the deepest truth about the 400 years, and perhaps about all of history. The people do not go away. They change. They absorb and are absorbed. Their political identities are superseded. Their languages are replaced. Their cultural practices are modified or abandoned or transformed into something unrecognizable to the people who originally practiced them. But the people, the biological continuity of human beings living in a place and having children in a place and dying in a place and being succeeded by their children, that continuity is almost never broken. The Roman soldiers who served on Hadrian's Wall and settled in Britain after their service had descendants who are still here. The Pictish farmers who watched the Dalriatan kingdom expand from the west had descendants who are still here. The Norse settlers who took over Orkney in the 9th century and maintained a Norse-speaking culture there until the 15th century had descendants who are still here. The silence of the 400 years is not the silence of a population that vanished. It is the silence of a population that was not equipped, for reasons partly of its own choosing and partly of circumstance, to leave behind the kind of records that later people would be able to read. Understanding this changes the question. Instead of asking what happened to the Picts, which implies that they disappeared in some dramatic or mysterious way, we should be asking what happened to Pictish culture and what happened to the political structure that the Pictish kingdom represented, and why those things ceased to persist when the biological reality of the Pictish people did not. And here, the historical evidence, fragmentary and contested as it is, does allow us to construct a provisional answer. The answer involves a man named Synaed mac Ailpin, known to later Scottish tradition as Kenneth mac Alpin, and a series of events in the 840 SCE that have generated more historical controversy per documented fact than almost any other episode in Scottish history. The traditional account, the account that was taught in Scottish schools for generations and that still appears in popular histories, is that Kenneth mac Alpin was a Gaelic king of Dalriata who conquered the Picts around 843 CE and united the two kingdoms to form the Kingdom of Alba, which is the direct ancestor of the Kingdom of Scotland. This account makes Kenneth the founder of Scotland, the man who created from the chaos of the 400 years a unified kingdom that would eventually, through centuries of further conflict and consolidation, become the Scotland that exists today. It is a satisfying narrative. It has a hero, a decisive moment, a clear outcome, and like most satisfying historical narratives, it is almost certainly a significant oversimplification of a much messier and more complicated reality. The problems with the traditional account begin with Kenneth himself. We do not know with certainty who his father was or what his claim to the Pictish kingship might have been. The name Ailpin is attested in Pictish king lists, as well as in the Dalriatan lineages, which means it is possible that Kenneth had Pictish ancestry on his father's side, which would make him not a foreign conqueror, but a man with a legitimate claim to Pictish kingship under the Pictish succession system. The Scottish chroniclers who preserved the accounts of his reign were writing considerably later and had strong incentives to present Kenneth as a great conqueror from the Gaelic tradition rather than as a man of mixed ancestry navigating complex dynastic politics. The image of Kenneth as conqueror was politically useful for the later Kingdom of Scotland in ways that the image of Kenneth as Pictish Gaelic dynast with a complicated family tree would not have been. History, especially the history of the 400 years, is full of this kind of retrospective simplification. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that, in the period around 840 to 850 CE, a political transformation of major significance occurred in northern Britain. The Pictish kingdom, which had been the dominant political power in the north for several centuries, ceased to exist as a separate political entity. Its kings were replaced by kings who identified themselves with the Gaelic Dalriatan tradition and who eventually adopted the Gaelic name for their territory, Alba. The Pictish aristocracy, to the extent that it survived the political transition, was absorbed into the new kingdom's aristocratic structures, presumably bringing with it the land rights and local power networks that aristocracies always bring when they negotiate their submission to a new overlord. The Pictish Church, which had been to some degree distinct from the Columban Church in its organization and its practices, was absorbed into the Columban tradition, and the Pictish language, which had been losing ground to Gaelic for generations, completed its transition toward extinction in the following century or two, leaving behind only the symbols on the stones and the ghost of itself in the place names of northeastern Scotland. The Viking context matters enormously here, and is often underemphasized in accounts of the 400 years. The 840s, the decade in which Kenneth's consolidation of power occurred, were one of the most violent decades in the history of the British Isles. Viking fleets were active throughout the Western Seas, raiding monasteries and coastal settlements with devastating effect. The Columban monastery of Iona, which had already suffered multiple raids in the early 9th century, was sacked again and again until the community of monks finally made the painful decision to transfer the most important relics and manuscripts to Kells in Ireland, beyond the reach of the Norse longships. The Pictish heartland in the east was not immune. Norse raiders pushed through the firths and up the river systems, attacking settlements that thought themselves safely inland. The kingdom of Strathclyde was devastated by the great Viking raid of 870. The Anglian kingdom of Northumbria was broken by the Danish Great Army in the 860s. The entire political landscape of Britain was being remade by Viking violence, and the transformation of the Pictish kingdom into the kingdom of Alba needs to be understood against this background of external pressure and internal disruption. In conditions of existential threat, political unions that might have seemed impossible in calmer times become not just possible but necessary. The Dalriatans and the Picts had been competing and fighting for centuries, but a Norse threat, severe enough to threaten both kingdoms simultaneously, might have created the incentive for a kind of merger that previous generations had not found compelling. Kenneth, whoever his exact ancestry was, may have been the right person at the right moment to broker such a merger, a man with claims to both kingdoms who could present himself as a legitimate ruler to both Gaelic and Pictish aristocracies, in a moment when the alternative to accepting a compromise king might have been destruction at the hands of Norse warlords who would offer no compromise at all. This is speculation. Almost everything about the political dynamics of the 840s is speculation because the documentation is so poor. But it is speculation grounded in what we know about how political unions tend to form, which is less often through outright conquest than through the negotiated submission of elites who calculate that survival under a new overlord is preferable to resistance that might result in their elimination. The 400 years, then, produced not a blank, but a transformation. 4 peoples with 4 languages and 4 distinct cultural traditions, all inhabiting the same territory simultaneously, all under pressure from Roman withdrawal in the south and Norse expansion from the north and east, worked out over centuries, a series of political and cultural accommodations that eventually produced something new. A kingdom that called itself Alba, and then Scotland, speaking Gaelic in its court and in its church, gradually extending Gaelic cultural influence across a territory that had been linguistically and culturally diverse, absorbing the Britons of Strathclyde and incorporating the Norse settlers of the north and the Anglian settlers of the southeast into a political community that remained contested and fragile for centuries, but that proved durable enough to survive, and to become the foundation of a modern nation. This is the story that the 400 years contain. Not a mystery in the sense of something supernatural or inexplicable, but a mystery in the sense of something profoundly human and genuinely difficult to reconstruct. The story of how peoples change, how cultures die and are born from the mixture of what dies, how political identities are created from the fragments of older identities, how the landscape holds the memory of all of this when the people themselves are gone. The Pictish symbol stones hold that memory. The place names hold that memory. The genes of the people of northeastern Scotland hold that memory. We cannot read all of it, but we can recognize its presence, and we can be humbled by the complexity of what we cannot read. There is a stone in a field in Angus. It stands roughly 2 meters tall, wider at the top than the bottom, leaning slightly in a way that suggests the ground has shifted around it over the 14 or 15 centuries since it was placed there. On one face it carries an incised symbol of the double disc and Z-rod, and below that a mirror case, both executed with a fluency and confidence that speaks of a craftsperson who has made these marks many times before and knows exactly what they are doing. On the reverse face, which was added at some point after the original carving, probably when the stone was rededicated or reused for a new purpose, there is a Christian cross, elaborately carved in relief, with panels of interlace that show clear Columban influence. The stone is thus a record of transition, a Pictish monument subsequently Christianized, speaking to the moment when the Columban mission moved into Pictish territory and began the process of conversion that would eventually transform the religious landscape of the north as thoroughly as the political transformations of the position. 9th century transformed its political landscape. This stone has a name, as many Pictish stones do, names given to them by local tradition across the centuries. It has a field associated with it. People have been walking past it, and around it, and occasionally stopping to look at it with puzzlement or curiosity or something approaching reverence for as long as anyone in the area can remember. The fact of its continued presence in the landscape, its persistence as a local landmark, is itself a form of cultural transmission, a way in which the Pictish past has been carried forward into the present, not through written records, but through the simple human habit of noticing things in the landscape and telling the next generation where they are and that they matter. This kind of transmission is invisible to historians who look only for texts, but it has been enormously important in preserving the physical presence of Pictish monuments, many of which would certainly have been destroyed, broken up for building material, or simply cleared away as nuisances, if local communities had not maintained some sense of their significance. The symbol stones are the most visible element of Pictish material culture, but they are far from the only one. The souterrains, the underground stone-lined passages that appear throughout the Pictish heartland, are another element that archaeologists have found difficult to interpret with confidence. They are typically constructed by digging a trench into the subsoil, lining it with dry stone walling, roofing it with stone lintels, and then covering the whole structure with earth. The passages can be quite long, sometimes extending 30 meters or more, and they are often associated with surface settlements of which they appear to have been a component, sometimes entered through the floor of a roundhouse or through a narrow doorway in a settlement boundary. What were they for? The obvious practical answer is food storage. Underground chambers with a constant cool temperature are excellent places to store meat and dairy products in a climate without refrigeration, and this is probably part of the answer. But souterrains are sometimes more elaborate than simple food storage would require, with curved passages, carefully constructed entrances designed to be difficult to enter quickly, and in some cases, evidence of occupation rather than just storage. They may have served multiple purposes at different times: storage in ordinary circumstances, refuge in emergencies, and possibly ritual functions that we can only guess at. The most elaborate souterrains, with their carefully dressed stonework and their sometimes quite beautiful construction, seem like more than purely practical structures. They seem like places that people cared about, that meant something beyond their utility as cold rooms. The brocks are even more impressive. These extraordinary dry stone towers, some of them still standing to heights of 10 or 12 meters, even after 2 millennia of decay and stone robbing, are confined almost entirely to Scotland, with the greatest concentrations in Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, and the far north of the mainland. The finest surviving example, the Broch of Musa on Shetland, stands to nearly 14 meters and retains enough of its internal structure to allow visitors to climb through the hollow walls to the top and look out over the voe it overlooks, getting something of the view its inhabitants would have had 2,000 years ago. Brochs date primarily to the period between roughly 200 BCE and 200 CE, which is the Iron Age period before and during Roman activity further south, and they represent an extraordinary investment of architectural skill and communal labor. Building a broch required the ability to plan a complex structure in advance, to organize and direct a large workforce over an extended period, to source and transport large quantities of stone, and to solve the engineering problems of constructing a tall, dry stone wall with hollow galleries and internal stairs. These were not simple people doing simple things. These were people with considerable technical sophistication, organized in ways that could direct substantial communal effort, living in a landscape that had been shaped by human activity and human thought for thousands of years. What the brocks were for is, like so much about the 400 years and the centuries surrounding them, not entirely clear. The most common interpretation is that they were defensive structures, places of refuge for a community and its livestock in a time of raiding and inter-community violence, which is very plausible given that the Iron Age was almost certainly a time of significant inter-community conflict. But the brocks also seem to have been statements of status, the largest and most elaborate ones built by the most powerful local elites as demonstrations of their ability to command labor and their claim to a particular territory. They may have had ceremonial functions as well, and some of them show evidence of continuous occupation over long periods, suggesting that whatever their original purpose, they became the central focus of a community's life in a way that went beyond simple defensibility. The Broch of Gunness in Orkney, for example, is surrounded by the remains of a substantial settlement, a cluster of stone buildings that grew up around the base of the broch over time, suggesting that the broch functioned as the anchor of a community, rather than a purely defensive structure to be retreated to in emergencies. The brochs are pre-Pictish in their origin, belonging to the Iron Age rather than to the early historic period, but they are part of the broader continuum of northern British material culture from which the Picts emerged. The people who built the brochs were the ancestors of the Picts, and the tradition of monumental stone construction that the brochs represent is part of the background against which the Pictish symbol stones need to be understood. The Picts inherited a landscape that had already been marked and shaped and given meaning by generations of people before them, and they continued that process of marking and shaping and meaning-making in their own distinctive way. When a Pictish craftsperson carved a symbol onto a stone and set it in a prominent location in the landscape, they were doing something that people in that landscape had been doing for thousands of years. They were leaving their mark, claiming the place, making visible a relationship between human community and particular piece of ground that everyone who passed by would understand as a declaration of identity and belonging. This relationship between people and place, this deep attachment to specific landscapes and specific features of the physical world, is one of the things that the textual silence of the 400 years cannot entirely erase, because it is inscribed not just in the stones, but in the landscape itself. Scotland is a country whose geography has shaped its history with unusual force. The Great Highland Boundary Fault, the geological feature that separates the highlands from the lowlands, is not just a physical division of terrain. It is a cultural divide that has been meaningful for as long as people have lived on both sides of it. The firths and sea locks that penetrate deep into the western coast created a world where communities were connected by water rather than separated by it, where the short sea crossings to Ireland and to the many islands were highways rather than barriers. The fertile arable land of the northeast, in what is now Aberdeenshire and Angus, supported denser populations and more settled agricultural communities than the thin soils of the interior highlands, which in turn shaped the different political structures that developed in different parts of the territory. The 400 years were not a period during which this geography ceased to matter. It was a period during which people continued to adapt to that geography, to negotiate with it, to find ways of living within its constraints and exploiting its possibilities in exactly the ways their predecessors had been doing for thousands of years. One of the things that geography shaped was the particular character of the oral tradition that carried the cultural memory of the 400 years across the generations when writing was absent or insufficient. Oral traditions are not simply inferior substitutes for written records. They are different forms of knowledge transmission with their own strengths and their own vulnerabilities. A written text is fixed. It says what it says, and if it survives, later readers can access exactly the words of the original, though they may not understand them correctly. An oral tradition is dynamic. It is transmitted through performance, through repetition with variation, through the ongoing effort of communities to keep their knowledge relevant and alive in changing circumstances. The things that oral traditions preserve best are things that can be given memorable form, that can be attached to specific places and specific events, that have emotional resonance, that carry moral or practical lessons. The things oral traditions are less good at preserving are precisely the things that historians most want to know. Precise dates, exact names, accurate descriptions of political processes. The oral tradition of the 400 years, to whatever extent it survived into the medieval period when some of it was written down, had already gone through many generations of reformulation and reinterpretation, so that what was written down was not the 400 years as they were lived, but the 400 years as they had been remembered and reimagined and made useful for communities living in very different circumstances. The genealogies are perhaps the most important surviving product of this oral tradition. Medieval Scottish genealogies, which claim to trace the ancestry of the royal dynasties and the great aristocratic families back to remote figures, some of them legendary or mythological, are not reliable historical documents in the modern sense. They contain errors, anachronisms, and deliberate falsifications made to serve political purposes. But they are not meaningless. They preserve names, some of which appear in other sources and can be partially corroborated. They preserve a sense of the connections between different dynasties and different territories. And they preserve, In the recurrence of certain names and certain narrative patterns, echoes of the 400 years that cannot be recovered from any other source. The figure of Fergus Mór mac Urk, who appears in the genealogical tradition as the ancestor of the Dal Riatan kings of Scotland, may or may not be a historical figure in any straightforward sense. But his presence in the tradition tells us something about how the Dal Riatans, and later the Scots, wanted to understand their own origins, as a migration from Ireland with a named founder, with a claim to a specific lineage that connected the new kingdom in the west to ancient authority in the east. The question of what the Picts believed, their pre-Christian religious and cosmological tradition, is one of the most tantalizing blanks in the 400 years. We know that the Picts were converted to Christianity over the course of the 5th through 7th centuries, a process that involved multiple missions from different directions, with Columba and his successors coming from the west and northwest, while other missionaries, some of them associated with the continental church tradition, rather than the Irish one, appear to have worked in the southern Pictish areas from the south and east. We know that the conversion was not instantaneous and was probably not complete for several generations. The survival of the pre-Christian symbols on stones erected well into the Christian period suggests that the old symbolic language retained meaning for its users even after Christianity had become the official religion of the Pictish court. But what that old symbolic language meant, what gods or spirits or cosmological principles it encoded, we cannot reconstruct from the evidence that survives. We have no Pictish mythology. We have no account of Pictish religious practices written by anyone who knew them from the inside. What we have are the symbols themselves, and the carved animals, and the hunting scenes and battle scenes that appear on some of the later stones, and these tell us that the Picts cared about certain animals in ways that went beyond the purely practical, that the deer and the eagle and the salmon and the wolf carried symbolic weight in their culture, that the hunt was a scene of sufficient cultural significance to be worth commemorating in stone. But what the deer meant, what the eagle meant, what narratives or beliefs attached to these images, we cannot say. The persistence of the animal imagery is itself suggestive. Across the full span of the symbol stone tradition, from the earliest incised stones to the latest cross slabs, certain animals appear again and again, rendered with a naturalistic skill that speaks to deep and sustained observation of the living creatures. The Pictish eagle is not a schematic symbol of eagleness. It is an eagle, rendered with attention to the particular way an eagle holds its body and positions its wings and tilts its head, with the beak curved just so, and the talons gripping just so, and the eye alert in exactly the way a real eagle's eye is alert. The person who carved these eagles had watched eagles, had known eagles in the way that people know things they live among and depend on and are shaped by. The same is true of the salmon, which appears in the Pictish repertoire with a specificity of observation that only comes from communities that have lived alongside salmon for generations, for whom the salmon's annual return from the sea is one of the organizing events of the year, one of the great demonstrations of the world's reliability and abundance. These animals are not merely decorative, they are present in the visual language of Pictish culture in ways that can only reflect their presence in the lived experience of Pictish communities, which is to say, in the rivers and the forests and the skies of northeastern Scotland, as they had been for as long as anyone could remember, and as they had been in the oral traditions and the ritual practices and the understanding of the natural world that the 400 years contained. The Druids are a complication that needs to be addressed, because they appear in almost every popular account of pre-Christian Scotland and Britain, sometimes in ways that are historically plausible, and sometimes in ways that are straightforwardly fantastical. The word Druid refers to a class of learned specialists who appear in ancient sources describing the Celtic-speaking peoples of Gaul and Britain, people who combined the functions that, in a literate society, would be separated among priests, lawyers, genealogists, poets, astronomers, and medical practitioners. The ancient sources, including Caesar's account of the Gauls and the historian Strabo, describe the Druids as preserving their knowledge through oral tradition, deliberately refusing to commit it to writing on the grounds that writing would debase the knowledge by making it accessible to those who had not undergone the long training necessary to use it properly. The training Caesar describes lasted 20 years, a figure that suggests a genuine apprenticeship tradition involving the memorization of enormous quantities of material, law, genealogy, cosmology, ritual practice, poetry, history. If something like this tradition existed in northern Britain, and it almost certainly did in some form, then the 400 years of textual silence looks very different. It is not the silence of an illiterate or culturally impoverished society. It is the silence of a society that chose to preserve its knowledge in forms that, by their nature, cannot survive the extinction of the people who held them. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of the 400 years, the recognition that there may have been an enormous body of knowledge, of poetry and law, and cosmological thought and historical memory, preserved in exactly the way that the tradition prescribed, in the memories of specialists whose entire lives were given over to the work of remembering, and that when those specialists died without successors who could carry on the tradition, all of that knowledge was simply gone, not lost in the sense of misplaced or destroyed, simply gone, as completely as if it had never existed, because it existed only in minds and not in any form that could survive the extinction of the minds that held it. The Druids of the Celtic world were not irrational or primitive. They were the keepers of a sophisticated intellectual tradition that had evolved over centuries to suit the needs of the communities it served. Their tradition simply lacked the redundancy that writing provides. Writing can be copied and distributed and hidden and rediscovered. A purely oral tradition is as mortal as its last practitioner. We catch occasional glimpses of what might be the residue of this tradition in the early Irish and Welsh literary sources, which were written down in the monastic scriptoria of the Christian period, but which preserve material that is clearly much older than the manuscripts that contain it. The Irish mythological cycle, with its stories of the Tuatha De Danann and the hero cycles of Ulster, contains narrative patterns and cosmological concepts that many scholars believe reflect pre-Christian religious and mythological traditions substantially older than the 7th and 8th century manuscripts in which they are preserved. The Welsh Mabinogion contains similarly archaic material. These sources are not Pictish, they are Gaelic and Brittonic respectively. But the people who made them were the neighbours and sometimes the cousins of the Picts, and the intellectual traditions they preserve may share common roots with whatever the Pictish tradition contained. We cannot say this with confidence. We can only note that the people who produced the symbol stones were not operating in a cultural vacuum, that they were embedded in a broader world of Celtic-speaking thought and art and cosmological vision that was extraordinarily rich, and that the absence of surviving Pictish texts tells us more about the accidents of preservation than about the richness or poverty of Pictish cultural life. Consider the monastery at Portmahomac in Easter Ross, which is perhaps the most remarkable recent archaeological discovery in the study of the 400 years. Portmahomac is a small village on the Tarbat Peninsula in the northeast of Scotland, and it had been known for some time that the area had produced a number of Pictish carved stones. But systematic excavation beginning in the 1990s revealed something extraordinary: the presence of a substantial early medieval monastery that appears to have been a centre of Pictish Christian culture of major importance. The excavations found evidence of book production, of metalworking and glass working of high quality, of a large church building and associated structures, and most significantly, of a library or scriptorium where manuscripts were being produced. The monastery appears to have been violently destroyed in the 9th century, probably by Viking raiders, and the evidence of the destruction, charred materials and smashed objects, and the abrupt end of the occupation sequence, is itself a statement about what the Viking raids meant for the survival of early Scottish documentary culture. Here was a place where Pictish Christians were producing manuscripts, presumably some of them in the Pictish language or containing information about Pictish history and culture, and the entire site was destroyed in what may have been a single catastrophic raid that left nothing of the library intact. Portmahomac is a reminder that the silence of the 400 years is not simply a reflection of cultural poverty or the absence of documentary activity. It reflects the physical destruction of places where documents were being made and stored. The Viking raids of the late 8th and 9th centuries, which devastated monasteries throughout Britain and Ireland, were not merely military events. They were cultural catastrophes, eliminating in a matter of hours the accumulated textual production of generations of scholars and scribes. We know about some of what was lost from Iona because the Columban tradition was well connected enough that some of its most important manuscripts were evacuated to Ireland before or during the raids. We have no comparable knowledge of what was lost at Portmahomac or at the other Pictish ecclesiastical centres that the archaeology tells us existed but the texts do not. The silence of those 400 years is in part the silence of libraries that burned, of manuscripts that were scattered into the wind, of the deliberate destruction of places where knowledge was being made. And yet even this destruction was not total. The people continued, the landscape continued, the practices continued in modified forms. When the Pictish kingdom became the kingdom of Alba, it did not immediately cease to be Pictish in any meaningful sense. The aristocracies that had been Pictish continued to hold their lands, continued to worship at the same churches, continued to make the same kinds of political and social arrangements that Pictish aristocracies had made for generations. The transition was real, but it was also in important ways continuous. The Gaelicization of the North, the replacement of Pictish cultural and linguistic forms by Gaelic ones, was a process that took generations, not decades. And throughout that process, the Pictish substrate persisted. In the landscape features that retained their Pictish names, in the artistic traditions that continued to be practiced even when the political context had changed, in the genes and the faces and the physical characteristics of people whose ancestors had been Pictish for 1,000 years. The 400 years, seen in this light, are not a gap or a blank or a mystery in the sense of something inexplicable. They are the period during which the foundations of modern Scotland were laid, not through any grand design or visionary plan, but through the accumulated decisions and adaptations of hundreds of thousands of people responding to the circumstances of their lives. The warrior who decided that the Dal Riatan king was preferable to the Norse warlord as an overlord and submitted accordingly was making a rational calculation about survival. The monk who chose to write in Latin rather than in Pictish was making a practical decision about which language gave his work the widest audience and the longest life. The woman who gave her children Gaelic names rather than Pictish ones was responding to the cultural prestige of the language that was increasingly dominant in the institutions that shaped life chances. These decisions accumulated into a transformation. The transformation looks, from outside and from the distance of centuries, like a replacement. From inside, it was probably experienced as a series of adaptations, each one making sense in its immediate context, none of them individually representing a decision to abandon who one was. The stones, the souterrains, the brocks, the place names, the genes, the fragments of genealogy, the carved animals and cryptic symbols. All of these are the residue of a civilization that did not think of itself as temporary or transitional or destined to be superseded. The people of the 400 years thought of themselves as the people of their time and their place, living in the landscape their ancestors had shaped, maintaining the traditions their predecessors had established, facing the challenges of their specific moment with the resources available to them. They did not know that the historians of the future would struggle to read their monument stones or that their language would vanish from the earth. They were simply living, as all people live, day by day, season by season, generation by generation, in a world that felt to them as solid and as real and as permanent as the stones they carved. The Norse arrival in Scottish waters is not a single event. It is a process, long and layered, and so thoroughly woven into the subsequent history of the North that to talk about Scotland without talking about the Norse is like talking about the landscape without talking about the ice that shaped it. The Norse, or Vikings as popular tradition calls them, with a term that actually refers to a specific activity, raiding, rather than to an ethnicity or a culture, began appearing in the waters around Britain and Ireland in the late 8th century. And from that point, they were a permanent feature of the political and cultural landscape for the next several centuries. But the relationship between the Norse and the peoples of what would become Scotland was far more complex than the straightforward narrative of violent raiders and innocent victims that popular history has sometimes presented. Yes, the raids were real, and their effects were devastating. The attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE, which is traditionally treated as the opening of the Viking Age in Britain, was followed by decades of intensifying Norse activity throughout the waters of the north. Iona was raided multiple times, in 795, in 802, in 806, when 68 members of the monastic community were killed in what the Irish annals call the martyrdom of Iona. These attacks were not random. They were targeted at precisely the kind of places where wealth was concentrated, where the accumulated donations of generations of pious aristocrats had created repositories of precious metalwork and fine manuscripts and other portable valuables that could be seized and removed. Monasteries were, from a Viking perspective, banks, and the Norse were extraordinarily effective bank robbers. But the Norse were also settlers, traders, farmers, craftspeople, and political actors of considerable sophistication. From the early 9th century onward, Norse settlers began establishing permanent communities in the Northern Isles, Orkney, and Shetland, which they controlled so thoroughly that the existing population, whatever its character had been, was either displaced or absorbed into the incoming Scandinavian community. The Pictish presence in Orkney, which had been substantial enough to produce some remarkable monument stones and a complex of high-status settlements, was effectively erased. The language of Orkney became Old Norse. The place names became Norse. The material culture became Norse. And then, centuries later, when Orkney was finally transferred from Norwegian to Scottish sovereignty in 1468 and 1469, pledged by the Norwegian king as security for the unpaid dowry of his daughter Margaret, who was marrying King James III of Scotland, the transformation reversed again, Norse giving way to Scots, though the Norse element in the dialect and the place names remained and remains to this day. The Western Isles experienced a different Norse relationship, one that was less wholesale replacement and more complex mixture. The Hebrides, which the Norse called the Sudrejar, the Southern Islands, in distinction from the Nordrejar, the Northern Islands, which are Orkney and Shetland, were colonized by Norse settlers from the early 9th century, but the indigenous Gaelic-speaking population was not eliminated. What developed in the Western Isles over the following 2 or 3 centuries was a hybrid culture, sometimes called Norse Gaelic or Gaul Gaedhil, the latter term meaning foreign Gaels, which is the name that Irish and Scottish sources give to people of mixed Norse and Gaelic ancestry. The Gaul Gaedhil were real and formidable historical actors who appear in the annals from the mid-9th century onward, sometimes allied with the Norse, sometimes with the Gaelic kingdoms, maintaining a distinct identity in the complex political world of the Western Sea. Their descendants, the Lords of the Isles, would be a defining feature of Scottish political history well into the 15th century, maintaining a semi-autonomous maritime kingdom in the west that the kings of Scots were never quite able to fully control and eventually destroyed only at enormous political cost. The Norse presence in the north and west of Scotland shaped the 400 years in ways that go beyond the dramatic events of raids and settlements. It created a new political context in which the existing kingdoms of the north, the Picts and the Dalriatans and the Britons of Strathclyde, were all simultaneously threatened and were all forced to rethink their political arrangements in response. It destroyed cultural centres, like Portmahomac, that might otherwise have preserved documentary evidence of the period. It introduced a new linguistic layer that is still visible in the place names of the north and west. And it created new opportunities, because the Norse networks of trade and contact that extended from Scandinavia through the British Isles to Iceland and eventually to North America were also networks of cultural exchange, and the communities that learned to navigate those networks could access goods and ideas and alliances that the more isolated political world of pre-Viking Scotland would not have provided. The silver in the great Pictish hoards, some of it clearly of Frankish or even Byzantine origin, speaks to the long-distance trade connections that existed in the centuries before the Viking Age, and the Norse expanded those connections even as they disrupted local political structures. The man who navigated this world most successfully, whose decisions shaped the subsequent history of Scotland more than those of any other figure in the 400 years, remains paradoxically one of the most poorly documented figures of the period. Kenneth MacAlpin, or Sinead Mac Ailpin in the Gaelic form, appears in the historical record in connection with the 840s, when the sources begin referring to him as King of the Picts and the Scots, and with the establishment of a new political centre at Scone, which would remain the coronation site of Scottish kings for centuries, where the famous Stone of Destiny, the Lia Fail, or Stone of Scone, was kept until Edward I of England seized it in 1296, and had it installed beneath the coronation throne at Westminster Abbey, where it remained until 1996. The Stone of Destiny is itself a mystery nested within the larger mystery of the 400 years. Its origins are disputed, its symbolism is debated, and the popular tradition that it was the stone on which Jacob laid his head when he dreamed of the ladder of angels at Bethel, a tradition recorded in Scottish sources from the medieval period, is almost certainly a later mythological accretion designed to give the stone the most ancient and sacred possible pedigree. What matters is that Kenneth chose Scone, a site in the heart of Pictish territory, as his political and ceremonial centre, which is consistent with the idea that he was not a foreign conqueror, imposing Gaelic culture on a defeated Pictish enemy, but rather a man making a claim to both traditions, establishing himself at the heart of the territory he was claiming as its legitimate king. The legend of Kenneth's treachery, preserved in a late text called the Dalriadan Chronicle, describes him inviting the Pictish nobility to a feast and then having them massacred while drunk, a story so convenient for later political purposes and so lacking in contemporary corroboration that most historians treat it with extreme skepticism. But it has proven remarkably persistent in popular accounts of the period, perhaps because it satisfies a narrative need for a dramatic moment of transition, a decisive event that explains the shift from Pictish to Scottish political dominance. Real history is rarely so obligingly dramatic. The transformation of the Pictish kingdom into the Kingdom of Alba was almost certainly a more protracted, more contested, more ambiguous process than a single night of treachery could capture. Kenneth was probably one important figure in a process that had been underway for generations and that continued long after his death, which appears to have occurred around 858 CE. What Kenneth did establish, or at least what was established in his name and in the names of his successors, was a dynasty, and dynasties have a way of generating the kind of documentation that otherwise often goes missing from early medieval history. The kings of Alba from Kenneth onward appear in genealogies and king lists and annalistic references with increasing frequency, and from the late 9th century onward the documentary record, while still fragmentary by the standards of later medieval history, is substantial enough to allow historians to reconstruct the broad outlines of Scottish political history with reasonable confidence. The 400 years are over, in the sense that the textual silence has ended, but the questions the silence posed do not end with it. They continue to reverberate through everything that comes after, because the Scotland that emerges from the 400 years is built on foundations that remain partially invisible, drawing on traditions and identities and cultural memories that the surviving texts only partially illuminate. The Christian transformation of Scotland in the 400 years is not simply the replacement of one religion by another. It is a far more complex process of cultural layering in which Christian frameworks were applied to landscapes and practices and community structures that were already deeply embedded with meaning from pre-Christian traditions, and in which the resulting mixture was distinctly different from the Christianity practiced in the Mediterranean heartlands of the faith, or even in the Romanized areas of southern Britain. Irish Christianity, the tradition that came to Scotland with Columba and his successors, had developed in an island that had never been part of the Roman Empire, which meant that it had never been shaped by the encounter between Christianity and Roman imperial administration that produced the particular institutional form of the Catholic Church. Irish monasticism was wilder, more individualistic, more deeply embedded in the landscape traditions of Celtic culture, more hospitable to the continuation of pre-Christian practices and beliefs in modified forms. The Irish monastic tradition produced extraordinary scholars who were simultaneously deeply Christian and deeply engaged with the native learning of their culture. Men like Columbanus, who founded monasteries throughout Frankish Gaul, or John Scotus Eriugena, whose philosophical work drew on the Neoplatonic tradition in ways that would later seem startlingly close to heresy, or the anonymous scribes, who preserved the Irish mythological material in the great manuscripts of the 12th century, and who seem to have felt no contradiction between their Christian faith and their interest in the stories of the 12 pre-Christian gods. This tradition shaped the Christianization of the Picts in ways that left considerable room for continuity with what came before. The Columban missionaries did not arrive in Pictland and immediately demand the destruction of everything that had preceded them. The evidence from the symbol stones, which show Christian and pre-Christian symbols coexisting on the same monuments, suggests a more gradual and more accommodating process. An initial incorporation of Christian symbols into existing monumental traditions, followed over time by a shift in which the Christian elements became dominant and the pre-Christian elements were retained in increasingly marginal or decorative roles, and eventually a full transition to monuments that were Christian in their primary visual grammar, even when traces of the old symbolic language persisted. This process took generations, and during those generations, the communities that were going through the transition were holding both frameworks simultaneously, finding ways to make the new faith meaningful in terms of the landscape and the seasonal rhythms and the community structures that they already had, rather than abandoning those frameworks in favour of something entirely foreign. The sacred landscape of pre-Christian Scotland, whatever exactly it contained, did not simply disappear when Christianity arrived. It was incorporated, renegotiated, transformed. The holy wells that appear throughout Scotland, associated with saints in the Christian tradition, are almost certainly in many cases pre-Christian sacred sites that were reassigned to Christian figures rather than abandoned. The practice of walking around sacred sites in a sunwise direction, which is documented in Scottish folk practice into the modern period and which has clear pre-Christian antecedents in the solar symbolism of the monument traditions, persisted in the Christian period as a practice associated with healing and blessing, even when its pre-Christian significance was no longer explicitly acknowledged. The great seasonal festivals of the agricultural calendar, Imbolc at the beginning of February, Beltane at the beginning of May, Lugnasad at the beginning of August, and Samhain at the beginning of November, which are documented in the Irish literary tradition as the major festivals of the pre-Christian Celtic calendar, were not abolished by Christianity. They were refashioned. Imbolc became the Feast of St. Brigid, whose Christian identity absorbed many of the characteristics of the pre-Christian goddess Brigid. Samhain became All Hallows' Eve and All Saints' Day. Beltane and Lugnasad continued as folk festivals in Scotland into the modern period without ever acquiring satisfactory Christian explanations. The festivals were too deeply embedded in the rhythms of agricultural life, too necessary for the community functions of gathering and celebration that they served, to be simply eliminated. The saints of early Scottish Christianity reflect this same pattern of absorption and transformation. Saint Columba himself is surrounded in his hagiographical tradition by stories that draw on older narrative patterns, encounters with monsters, contests with druids, the use of sacred power to influence natural phenomena. These stories are not necessarily fabrications, but they are told in frameworks that make Columba comprehensible in terms of a tradition of sacred power that predates Christianity, and that his audience would have found meaningful precisely because it echoed familiar patterns of thought about how holy people interact with the world. The Druids, whom Columba encounters and defeats in the hagiographical narratives, are not necessarily historical figures. They are narrative foils, representatives of the old order whose supersession by the new is the theological point that the stories are designed to make. But their presence in the narratives tells us something about the cultural world in which those narratives were produced and received. A world in which the memory of a pre-Christian learned class was still alive enough to serve as a meaningful reference point, to be invoked as the thing that Christianity had replaced and surpassed. The monasteries that Columba and his successors founded throughout Scotland were not simply places of prayer. They were cultural centres of enormous importance, performing functions that in a later and more differentiated society would be distributed among universities, hospitals, archives, and art schools. Monks copied manuscripts and produced new ones. They maintained schools that educated the sons of the aristocracy in Latin learning and presumably in the native literary traditions as well. They provided medical care, maintained guest houses for travellers, served as banks and archives for communities that needed to store valuables and records. They organised and often directed the labour of the communities around them, participating in the agricultural economy while also serving its spiritual needs. The great monasteries, Iona, Dunkeld, St Andrews, Deer, and the other major foundations of the early Scottish Church, were nodes in a network of cultural and economic exchange that linked the scattered communities of the north to each other and to the wider Christian world. When the Norse raids destroyed some of these centres and disrupted the networks connecting others, they were not simply attacking places of prayer. They were attacking the infrastructure of culture, the places where knowledge was made and kept and transmitted, and the damage they did was in this sense cultural as much as military. The Book of Deer, which is a small manuscript gospel book produced in the monastery of Deer in Aberdeenshire, probably in the 9th or 10th century, and which is now held in the Cambridge University Library, is one of the most precious surviving objects of the 400 years and the centuries immediately following. It is precious first as a gospel book, as a product of the kind of careful scribal and artistic work that characterized the Columban monastic tradition. But it is most precious as the accidental host of something else entirely, a series of notes, written in Scottish Gaelic and in Latin, in the margins of the manuscript by the monks of Deir in the 11th and 12th centuries, recording the grants of land and privileges made to the monastery by various local rulers. These margin notes are the oldest surviving texts in Scottish Gaelic. They are not Pictish, they are already Gaelic, but they record a world that is still deeply local, still organized around the kinds of community structures and land relationships that the 400 years would have recognized, still using terminology that reflects the long continuity of northern British social organization beneath the changing political superstructure. The Book of Deir's margin notes are a tiny window into a world that otherwise left very few written traces, and even this window is accidental. The monks who wrote these notes were not intending to create a historical document. They were trying to protect their monastery's property rights by writing down their records in a manuscript that was clearly old and authoritative, so that the records would be taken seriously. History often survives by accident, preserved because it served some immediate practical purpose that had nothing to do with the interests of later historians. The Abernethy Round Tower, which stands in the small town of that name in Perthshire, and which is one of only two Irish-style round towers surviving in Scotland, the other being at Brechin in Angus, is another kind of physical testimony to the 400 years. Round towers of this type, built as freestanding structures adjacent to churches rather than as integral parts of them, are common in Ireland, where they appear to have served multiple functions, as bell towers to call the faithful to worship, as watch towers to give warning of approaching raiders, and possibly as places of refuge where the most precious objects of the monastery could be hauled up and the door ladder pulled in when the Norse longships appeared. The Abernethy Tower dates to the late Pictish or early Alba period, and its presence at a site that was one of the major Pictish royal and ecclesiastical centres speaks to the continuation of monastic life and building activity in the period after the formal end of the Pictish kingdom, suggesting that the transition from Pictish to Alba was indeed less catastrophic and more continuous than the dramatic accounts of Viking destruction and Gaelic conquest might lead one to expect. Standing at the base of the Abernethy Round Tower on a grey October morning, which is the kind of morning that Scotland specialises in producing, is an experience that the word evocative does not quite capture. The tower is real and present, a physical object that has been standing in roughly this condition for 1,000 years, 1,000 years of winters and springs, and the particular quality of Scottish morning light that is simultaneously grey and clarifying, that makes everything look both smaller and more precise than it does in stronger light. Around the tower, the modern town of Abernethy goes about its business in ways that have nothing to do with Pictish kings or Irish missionaries or Viking raiders. Cars pass. Dogs are walked. Children go to school. The tower stands among all of this as a presence from another time, a time when this place was one of the most important centres of power in the north, when kings came here, when the decisions made here shaped the subsequent history of a country. The tower cannot speak. It can only stand, which it has been doing for 1,000 years, and will presumably continue to do for some time to come, holding the memory of all the mornings that have passed around it, all the lives that have been lived in its shadow, all the history that has accumulated in the centuries since the hands that built it let go of the final stone. This is what the 400 years leave behind, in the end. Not explanations, not answers to all the questions that historians and archaeologists and genetic scientists have been asking, but presences. Real, physical, tangible presences in the landscape. The stones with their cryptic symbols, the brocks standing against the northern sky, the round towers, the holy wells, the place names that hold their Pictish and Brittonic and Gaelic and Norse and Anglian syllables across the centuries, the ancient hill forts that remain visible as earthwork shapes on the summits of hills that people have been climbing for 5,000 years. These presences are not silent, they are speaking in languages that we are still learning to read, and the process of learning to read them, the work that archaeologists and linguists and geneticists and historians are doing, with improving tools and with a growing awareness of how much they do not know, is itself a form of connection to the 400 years and to the people who lived them. The 400 years are not lost. They are encoded in the land and in the bodies of the people who still live there, and in the fragile documentary residues that survived the raids and the fires and the political transformations and the simple attrition of time. What is lost is our ability to read all of that encoding with confidence, to hear the full complexity of what those centuries contained. But the encoding is there, and as the tools improve, as ancient DNA analysis becomes more refined, as computational approaches to the analysis of place name distributions reveal new patterns, as archaeological fieldwork uncovers new sites and new evidence, the 400 years become gradually more legible, not transparent, not fully known, perhaps never to be fully known, but less opaque than they were a generation ago, and likely to become less opaque still as the work continues. What the landscape remembers is different from what texts remember. Texts remember what someone decided was worth writing down, which is always a selection shaped by the interests and the blind spots and the political needs of the person doing the writing. The landscape remembers everything that has been done to it and in it, without selection, without agenda, in the form of patterns of soil chemistry and crop marks visible from the air in dry summers, and the distribution of specific plant species that favor disturbed or enriched ground, and the subtle topographic features that reveal the subtle presence of buried structures beneath what looks to the casual eye like an ordinary field or hillside. Archaeologists have learned to read these landscape memories with increasing sophistication, and what they are finding in the landscape of Scotland is a density of human activity across the 400 years and the millennia before them that was simply not visible a generation ago. Aerial photography, which began to be used systematically for archaeological purposes in Britain in the 1920s, has revealed hundreds of crop mark sites in Scotland that would not be detectable on the ground. Circular ring ditches that mark the positions of roundhouses no longer standing above the surface. Long, straight features that indicate the positions of Roman marching camps or later field boundaries. The complex interlocking shapes that betray the presence of multiple phases of activity at a single location across centuries of occupation. The Tayside region, which was the heartland of Pictish settlement in the south, shows a density of crop mark sites that speaks to a genuinely populous and intensively farmed landscape in the early historic period. A landscape very different from the sparsely inhabited wilderness that later Scottish Romantic tradition, with its emphasis on the wild and the sublime, has sometimes projected backward onto the period. Light detection and ranging technology, the aerial laser scanning technique that has revolutionized archaeology in forested landscapes by penetrating the tree canopy to reveal the ground surface beneath, has only begun to be applied systematically to Scottish landscapes, but is already producing remarkable results. In areas where dense vegetation had previously made systematic survey impossible, LiDAR is revealing the outlines of field systems, settlement sites, and earthwork monuments that are invisible to conventional aerial photography and that ground survey alone would require centuries to map. The patterns emerging from these surveys are already changing the picture of how densely settled and how intensively managed the Scottish landscape was in the period of the 400 years and before, suggesting that the historical accounts that describe sparse populations and undeveloped territories are substantially underestimating the human presence in the north. The most significant recent revolution in the study of the 400 years is, however, not in landscape archaeology, but in genetics. Ancient DNA analysis, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from the skeletal remains of people who died in the distant past, has transformed our understanding of prehistoric and early historic population movements throughout Europe, and the results as they apply to Scotland are both confirming some long-held hypotheses and overturning others in ways that will take years to fully absorb and interpret. The fundamental finding, which is now established beyond reasonable scientific doubt from the analysis of hundreds of ancient genomes from Britain and Ireland, is that the population of Britain, in the early historic period, was substantially descended from the Bronze Age influx of steppe ancestry that replaced much of the Neolithic population, with the subsequent Neolithic and Bronze Age population mix then modified by the additional input of Iron Age migrations from the continent, By the Roman period's demographically complex interactions between the native population and the soldiers and traders and enslaved people who came with the Roman world, and by the early medieval migrations of Anglo-Saxons, Norse, and Gaelic-speaking peoples that are documented in the historical record and that are now visible in the ancient DNA as well, the picture is one of continuous population mixing rather than replacement, with each new wave of migrants adding to, rather than simply overwriting what came before, creating a palimpsest population whose genetic ancestry reflects all the layers of its history. For the Picts specifically, the ancient DNA evidence is still accumulating as researchers work through the skeletal collections from Pictish period burial sites, but the early results are already illuminating. The Picts, so far as the genetic evidence indicates, were not a genetically distinct population in the way that would support theories of exotic origin. They were not more closely related to continental European populations than other British groups in ways that would indicate a recent migration from outside Britain, and they were not carrying genetic signatures that might indicate the presence of a significant pre-Celtic population substratum distinguishable from the rest of the British genetic pattern. They were, in genetic terms, Northern British people, the descendants of all the population movements that had passed through Britain over the preceding millennia, with the particular regional pattern of mixture that reflected the somewhat different migratory histories of the North compared to the South and Southeast. Their distinctive cultural identity was cultural and political and linguistic, rather than primarily genetic, which is consistent with what most historians of ethnicity have come to understand about how group identities work in general. They are constructed through shared practices and shared narratives and shared political experiences, not through biological distinctiveness. This finding has important implications for one of the most persistent questions about the Picts, the question of what happened to them. The traditional framing, influenced partly by the drama of the Pictish kingdom's political disappearance in the 9th century, has sometimes implied that the Picts somehow vanished, that they were absorbed or replaced in a demographic sense by the incoming Gaelic culture. The genetic evidence makes this impossible. The population of northeastern Scotland today shows clear genetic continuity with the ancient populations of the same region, which means that the biological descendants of the Picts are still living in Aberdeenshire and Angus, still farming the same land their ancestors farmed, still carrying in their bodies the genetic legacy of the people who carved the symbol stones and fought the Angles at Nectansmere. What changed was their cultural identity, not their biological continuity. The Pictish kingdom became the Kingdom of Alba, the Pictish language became Gaelic, the Pictish nobility became the Scottish nobility, but the people who were Pictish peasants and craftspeople and farmers in the 9th century were the great-grandparents of the people who were Scottish peasants and craftspeople and farmers in the 11th century. The biological line was unbroken. Only the cultural overlay changed. This realization, which the genetic evidence is now making demonstrably, rather than merely theoretically true, changes the way we should think about the 400 years. The 400 years are not a period of replacement. They are a period of transformation, in which a cultural and political identity that had real substance and real meaning for the people who held it was gradually replaced by a different cultural and political identity that served the needs of the people living through the prosegmented transformation. The Picts did not disappear. They became Scots, in the same way that the Roman Britons of the south did not disappear but became English, speaking a different language and living within different political structures, while remaining the same people in any meaningful biological sense. The tragedy of the Picts, if it is a tragedy, is not that they were killed or expelled, but that the culture they created, the language they spoke, the symbols they carved, the oral tradition they maintained, failed to find the kind of institutional support and protection that would have allowed it to survive the political transition. Gaelic had the monastery. Gaelic had the support of the most powerful ecclesiastical institution in the north. Gaelic had the political prestige of the new ruling dynasty. Pictish had none of these things after the merger, and without institutional support, cultures and languages tend not to survive for long in the face of pressure from more institutionally powerful alternatives. The place name evidence, which is the most widely distributed and in some ways the most democratically preserved residue of the 400 years, continues to yield new information as scholars apply more sophisticated analytical methods to the vast corpus of Scottish place names. The distribution of names incorporating the Gaelic element, pit, from the Brittonic word pet, meaning a share or portion of land, which appears in hundreds of place names in the Pictish heartland, places like Pittodrie and Pitlochry and Pittrevy and dozens of others, has long been recognised as a marker of Pictish period settlement and land organisation. But more recent work has suggested that the Pit names reflect not just the presence of Pictish-speaking people, but a specific system of land division and tenure that was already in place in the Pictish period and that survived, as a practical administrative reality, long after the Pictish language itself had been replaced by Gaelic. The persistence of the Pit element in Gaelic-speaking communities that had forgotten what it originally meant is evidence that the land organisation it encoded was continuous across the political transition, that the farms and the fields and the community structures that the Pictish land system had created continued to exist and to function even when the language and the political identity of the people using them had changed. Infrastructure outlasts the cultures that created it. The Ogham inscriptions that survive in Scotland, most of them in the Pictish heartland, remain one of the most frustrating and most fascinating residues of the 400 years. Ogham is a writing system that was developed in Ireland, probably in the 4th or early 5th century CE, that represents an alphabet of 20 letters, using groups of strokes cut across or beside a central stem line, typically the edge of a stone. It was used in Ireland primarily for commemorative inscriptions, typically recording personal names in the genitive case, with a formula meaning something like of the family of or belonging to, and it spread from Ireland to Scotland, Wales, and southwestern England during the early medieval period, along with the spread of the Gaelic-speaking peoples and their cultural influence. Most Ogham inscriptions in Scotland are in Gaelic, which is what you would expect given that the Gaelic-speaking Dalriatans were the people most closely associated with the Ogham tradition. But a small number of Scottish Ogham inscriptions, found primarily in the Pictish heartland of the East, appear to be in a language that is not Gaelic, a language that has been identified by most scholars as Pictish, though given how little we know about Pictish, this identification is itself based on reasoning that is partially circular. We identify these inscriptions as Pictish, partly because they are in a territory we associate with the Picts, and partly because the words in them do not match the vocabulary we expect in Gaelic. What the words actually mean, whether they are personal names or something else, whether they follow grammatical patterns that would allow us to identify the language more precisely, remains deeply uncertain. There are not enough of them, and they are not long enough, and they are not accompanied by any bilingual key that would allow us to decode them. They are tantalizing evidence of a written tradition that we cannot fully access. The question of whether the Picts had a broader writing tradition beyond the Ogham inscriptions and the carved symbols is one that cannot be answered with confidence given the current evidence. The discovery of the Port Mahomac monastery and its evidence for manuscript production in the Pictish period suggests that there was at least some Pictish ecclesiastical writing, presumably in Latin given the context, but possibly also including vernacular material. But the destruction of that site, and presumably of other Pictish ecclesiastical centres by the Norse raids, means that we are working with what survived rather than what existed, and the relationship between the two may be very imperfect. It is entirely possible that there was a substantial body of Pictish written material, ecclesiastical texts, and perhaps vernacular literary and historical material as well, that was simply destroyed in the raids of the late 8th and 9th centuries, and that no trace of which has survived. We cannot know this. We can only note that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that the presence of Port Mahomac shows that Pictish Christians were engaged in the kind of scholarly and scribal activity that in other contexts produced substantial documentary records. The surviving early Scottish ecclesiastical sites are themselves a landscape of memory that rewards careful attention. The great complex at St Andrews in Fife, which would become the ecclesiastical capital of Scotland in the medieval period, and which remains one of the most visited places in Scotland today, primarily because of its golf course and its ruined medieval cathedral, has origins that go back to the Pictish period, when it was known as Kinrymont, and was the site of a significant church that claimed to possess relics of the Apostle Andrew. The story of how Andrew's relics came to Scotland, which involves a 4th century Greek monk named Rule or Regulus being directed by an angel to carry the relics to the ends of the earth and being shipwrecked on the Fife coast as a result, is clearly legendary in its details. But the establishment of a Pictish royal church at Kinrymont, with claimed apostolic connections, is historically credible and fits with what we know about the Pictish Church's tendency to invest heavily in relic cults as a way of establishing ecclesiastical prestige. The Apostle Andrew was a high-status relic in the early medieval church, and the claim to possess his bones gave Kinrymont a significance that extended far beyond the local, connecting it to the broader network of Christian holy places and giving the Pictish Church an international dimension that it otherwise might have lacked. Dunkeld in Perthshire, which became the primary centre of the Columban Church in Scotland after the Viking raids made Iona untenable as a major institutional base, is another site where the Pictish and the Columban traditions meet. The relics of Columba himself were transferred to Dunkeld, probably in the early 9th century, and the town became in some sense the spiritual capital of the new kingdom of Alba, the place where the political and religious identities of the merged Pictish and Dalriatan worlds were given institutional expression. The cathedral at Dunkeld, which sits beside the River Tay, at a point where the river enters the highland landscape from the southern plains, is medieval rather than early historic in the structure that survives today, but its site and its connections are much older, and the landscape around it, the Perthshire hills and the great river valley, must have looked substantially similar to those who gathered here in the 9th and 10th centuries to witness the establishment of the new order. The River Tay itself is worth dwelling on, because rivers were not simply geographical features in the world of the 400 years. They were sacred entities, boundaries, highways, and sources of identity. The Tay is the largest river in Scotland by volume of water, draining a vast catchment that includes some of the most dramatic highland landscapes in the country, and it has been a presence in Scottish life for as long as people have been here. Its name is pre-Celtic in origin, possibly deriving from a root that means silent or flowing, and it appears in the earliest written sources about the north as a major landmark and a boundary. Pictish royal sites cluster along its valley. Scone, where Kenneth MacAlpin established his political centre, is on the Tay. Fort Eviot, which appears in the sources as a major Pictish royal residence, is on the Water of May close to where it joins the Erne, itself a Tay tributary. The concentration of Pictish royal power in this valley is not coincidental. The Tay Valley is one of the most fertile agricultural areas in Scotland, capable of supporting the densest populations and the largest agricultural surpluses, and it was the agricultural surplus of this region that ultimately funded the political and military apparatus of the Pictish kingdom. Understanding the economic geography of the 400 years is essential to understanding everything else about them, because political power in the early medieval world was ultimately a function of the ability to extract agricultural surplus from the landscape and use it to fund warriors and craftspeople and ecclesiastics and the other specialized roles that a complex society requires. The Picts were not living off the land as subsistence farmers. They were organized in ways that allowed the accumulation of surplus at centers controlled by an elite, and the distribution of that surplus to buy loyalty, fund military campaigns, commission art and architecture, and support the monastic institutions that provided the cultural infrastructure of the kingdom. The silver hoards, the great brooches, the elaborate metalwork that has been found at Pictish sites are evidence of this accumulated wealth and its deployment in the political economy of the period. They speak to a society that was economically sophisticated, that understood the relationship between agricultural productivity and political power, and that had developed the administrative mechanisms to manage that relationship across a substantial territory. The Pictish law codes, if they existed in written form, have not survived, but the existence of law codes can be inferred from the existence of the kind of administrative and political structures that the Pictish kingdom demonstrably possessed. Complex political entities require legal frameworks to function, mechanisms for resolving disputes, for establishing property rights, for defining the obligations of different social classes to each other and to the central power. These mechanisms can be transmitted orally, and in the Pictish case, they almost certainly were in the period before the Christian missions established written culture in the north, but the content of those oral legal traditions would have reflected the practical needs of a society organized in specific ways. When the Pictish kingdom was absorbed into Alba, its legal traditions were presumably partly absorbed as well, modified and reformulated to fit the new political context, and traces of specifically Pictish legal concepts may survive in the early Scottish law codes that are among the first documentary materials produced by the Kingdom of Alba. Identifying those traces is difficult because the later compilers of Scottish law were not interested in preserving Pictish legal traditions as such, but the work is being done by scholars who are alert to the possibility. The oral poetry of the 400 years, which almost certainly existed in some form and which may have been extensive and sophisticated, is almost entirely lost. We know from the Irish tradition, which is better documented than the Pictish, that the poets of the Celtic world occupied a position of considerable social prestige and political importance. The Irish Philid, the learned poet genealogists, who were the secular counterparts to the monastic scholars, maintained an extensive oral literary tradition that included praise poetry for kings and warriors, genealogical verse that encoded the kinship networks of the aristocracy, mythological narratives, and what we might call historical poetry, verse accounts of important events that served as the equivalent of chronicles. The Welsh bardic tradition, documented in the poems attributed to Taliesin and Aneirin and preserved in manuscripts of the medieval period, includes material that appears to reflect genuinely early origins, including the poem known as Y Gododin, which commemorates a catastrophic raid by warriors from the kingdom of the Gododin, the Brittonic people of the Edinburgh area, against an Anglian power centre at Cattraeth, probably Catterick in Yorkshire, in what may have been the late 6th century. Y Gododin is thus a direct poetic witness to the world of the 400 years, preserved in a Welsh manuscript tradition but dealing with events that occurred in what is now Scotland, commemorating warriors whose names are Brittonic and whose world is the world of the northern British kingdoms in the period immediately before the Anglian expansion began to transform the political landscape of the southeast. If Welsh tradition preserved Y Gododin, what did the Pictish tradition preserve? We do not know. There may have been an equivalent body of Pictish praise poetry, an equivalent tradition of commemorative verse that preserved the names and the deeds of Pictish kings and warriors in forms that could have survived into the medieval period if the political transition had been less thorough in its cultural effects. But the Gaelicization of the North, reinforced by the prestige of the Columban Church and the political dominance of the Dal Riatan dynasty, seems to have been sufficiently complete that Pictish oral literary traditions were not maintained and not transmitted. The bards, or their Pictish equivalents, whatever they were called, presumably continued to function in the period immediately after the political merger, but they were functioning in a world where their audience was increasingly Gaelic-speaking and where the political power they served was expressing itself in Gaelic cultural terms. The transition from Pictish to Gaelic, as the language of courtly culture would have been, for a tradition of oral poetry whose whole function was to celebrate and memorialize the great and the powerful, a transition that could not be managed gradually. You cannot praise a Gaelic king in Pictish and have the praise be effective if the court no longer understands Pictish. The poets would have shifted to Gaelic, and in shifting, they would have left the Pictish literary tradition behind. This is how traditions die, not through dramatic ruptures, but through the accumulation of small practical decisions, each of them individually rational, each of them reflecting the specific pressures and opportunities of a specific moment, until, at some point, the critical mass of practitioners who could maintain the tradition is no longer there, and the tradition itself ceases to be transmitted and becomes merely historical rather than living. The Pictish literary tradition, whatever it contained, whatever extraordinary things it may have said about the world as the people of the 400 years experienced it, went through this process sometime in the 9th or 10th or 11th century, and by the time anyone thought to look for it, it was gone. What remained was the trace, the residue in the place names and the symbols and the genetics and the landscape, the ghost of something that had been real and substantial and alive, now only legible in fragments, and those fragments only partially understood. There is a quality of grief that attaches to this recognition, a grief that is different from the grief we feel for people we have known, but that is grief nonetheless. The grief of knowing that something of value existed and cannot be recovered, that minds of genuine power and sensitivity lived and thought and created in those 400 years and left behind so much less than they deserved, not because they failed to create, but because the circumstances of history conspired to destroy what they created or to leave it in forms we cannot fully read. The people who carved the symbol stones were artists. The people who built the brooks were engineers. The people who maintained the legal and genealogical traditions of the Pictish kingdom were scholars. The people who performed the oral poetry and the religious rituals and the seasonal ceremonies of the 400 years were participants in a rich cultural life that the accidents of history have made largely inaccessible to us. We are the poorer for not being able to hear them more clearly. And the recognition of that poverty, the recognition that history is always incomplete, that the past is always larger than our ability to recover it, is itself a form of intellectual and emotional humility that the study of periods like the 400 years is uniquely well suited to produce. But humility does not require despair. The work of recovery is ongoing and is producing real results. Each generation of scholars and archaeologists and scientists brings new tools and new methods to the study of this period, and each generation learns things that the previous generation did not know. The ancient DNA revolution has transformed the field in the last decade. The LiDAR surveys are transforming it now. The systematic application of place name analysis, the continued work on the Pictish symbol stones, the excavation of new sites, and the reanalysis of old ones with better dating techniques and better understanding of the material culture, all of this work is gradually making the 400 years more visible, more populated, more real. The people of those centuries are not vanishing further into the darkness. They are, slowly, becoming more legible. And there is something else that the 400 years offer, beyond the specific historical content of the period itself. They offer a lesson about the relationship between silence and significance, about the danger of equating the absence of documentation with the absence of meaning. The 400 years in Scotland were not an empty period waiting for history to begin. They were a period of extraordinary human activity and creativity and cultural richness that left behind traces we are still learning to read. Whenever we encounter a period or a people or a culture that has left few written records, the lesson of the 400 years is to resist the temptation to assume that the silence reflects a corresponding poverty of human experience. The silence almost always reflects instead a poverty of preservation, the accidents of which materials survived and which did not, which institutions had the resources and the motivation to maintain records and which did not, which landscapes preserved the traces of human activity and which eroded or flooded or were built over. The past was always full. What varies is our ability to see it. Scotland itself has internalized this lesson more fully than many countries, partly because the experience of having a significant portion of its documentary heritage destroyed or removed by English forces over the centuries, most dramatically in the Wars of Independence, when Edward I of England seized not just the Stone of Destiny, but a substantial portion of the Scottish Royal Archive, has made the country acutely aware of how contingent the survival of historical records is, and how much of the past depends on what happens to survive rather than on what actually occurred. The Scottish national consciousness, which places enormous weight on historical memory and on the preservation of cultural identity against external pressure, is in part a product of this experience of loss and of the effort required to maintain a sense of national continuity in the face of that loss. The 400 years of silence are, in this sense, a founding experience of Scottish cultural identity, a demonstration that the absence of records does not mean the absence of a people, that identity can persist and transmit itself through means other than the official documentary record, and that the determination to know one's own history, even when that history is difficult to recover, is itself a form of cultural survival. The Highlands and the Lowlands of Scotland developed, over the centuries following the 400 years, into what might seem like two almost separate cultural worlds. The Gaelic-speaking Highlands, with their clan structures and their oral literary traditions, and their particular relationship to the land, and the Scots-speaking Lowlands, with their closer connection to the political and economic currents of the wider British and European world. This division, which is already visible in embryo in the different political histories of the northern and southern parts of the country during the 400 years, has been a defining feature of Scottish history ever since, and the tensions and connections between the two worlds have shaped Scottish culture in ways that are still felt today. But the apparent opposition between Highland and Lowland, between Gaelic and Scots, between the world of the clan and the world of the burgh, is in some ways misleading, because it tends to obscure the deep continuities that underlie the apparent contrasts. The genetic evidence, again, is instructive. The genetic ancestry of Highland and Lowland Scots is more similar than the cultural contrast might suggest, reflecting the common origins of both populations in the ancient substrate of northern British ancestry, overlaid by the various later migrations that affected both regions, and the boundaries between Highland and Lowland have always been more permeable than the cultural contrast would imply, with continuous movement of people, goods, and ideas across what looks on a map like a sharp divide, but is in practice a zone of transition and interaction. The 400 years created the conditions for both. They created a political entity, the Kingdom of Alba and eventually Scotland, that was large enough and coherent enough to provide a framework within which both the Gaelic Highland tradition and the Scots Lowland tradition could develop. They created the ecclesiastical infrastructure, centred on Iona and then Dunkeld and then St. Andrews, that gave Scottish Christianity its distinctive character, and that connected it to the broader European tradition while maintaining specific local features. They created the legal and administrative framework, built on Pictish and Dal Riatan foundations, and modified over time by Anglian and Norse influences, that would provide the institutional basis for the medieval kingdom. And they created, in the landscape itself, in the patterns of settlement and land use and sacred geography that the 400 years established, a foundation that shaped everything that came after, that is still visible in the aerial photographs, and the LiDAR surveys, and the distribution of farm names, and the course of boundaries that follow the lines established in those centuries. The 400 years are not a mystery in the sense of something that cannot be understood. They are a mystery in the sense of something that cannot be fully understood, that always has more to reveal, that rewards continued attention and continued inquiry with new information and new perspective. They are, in this sense, like Scotland itself, a place that always has more to show you, that changes with the light and the season in ways that continuously reveal new facets of what has always been there, that refuses to be fully known and is the more interesting for that refusal. The stones stand in their fields, the symbols carved on them as crisp as they were when the chisel left them, speaking in a language we are still learning, patient as only stone can be patient, waiting for the generations of scholars and scientists and curious people who will continue the work of trying to understand what they say. What they say, at minimum, is this: we were here. We were real. We cared about things that were worth caring about. We made things that were worth making. We lived in this landscape with intensity and attention and love, and we left our marks on it in forms that have survived 1,500 years of weather and politics and cultural transformation, and we are still here in the genes of the people who still farm the same land, and in the place names that still carry our syllables, and in the stones that still stand in the fields that we marked as our own. We are not entirely gone. We are still speaking. And the work of hearing us is the work of paying attention to the evidence that persists when the voice itself has fallen silent, which is the fundamental work of history, and which is never finished, and which is always worth doing. The story of the first Scots, the people who inhabited the territory that would become Scotland in those 400 years between Roman withdrawal and the emergence of a recognizable Scottish national tradition, is not a story of absence or darkness or silence. It is a story of extraordinary human complexity, of multiple peoples with multiple languages and multiple cultural traditions working out, under the pressure of external threat and internal competition, how to live together in a shared landscape, and producing from that working out the foundations of a nation that still exists and that still finds its identity partly in its relationship to the deep past that those centuries contain. The 400 years are Scotland's origin story, imperfectly preserved, partially legible, endlessly fascinating. They are why Scotland looks the way it looks, and why Scottish culture feels the way it feels, and why the Scots, for all the vicissitudes of their history, have maintained a sense of themselves as a distinct people with a distinct identity rooted in a specific place and a specific past. The past is there, in the land and in the stones and in the bodies of the people who live there now. It is not lost. It is simply waiting to be read more clearly, which is what all pasts are waiting for, and what the best of history is always trying to do. There are islands at the edge of Scotland where the 400 years feel closer than they do anywhere else. Orkney sits 15 miles off the northern tip of the mainland, a cluster of low green islands separated from each other and from the mainland by waters that the tides make treacherous and that the winds make unpredictable, waters that nonetheless have been navigated continuously for 10,000 years by people who understood them with the intimacy that comes only from complete dependence. Orkney is, in some sense, the place where Scottish prehistory is most legible, because the combination of a relatively stable stone-building tradition, a dry climate by northern standards, and a long history of careful archaeological attention has preserved more of the physical record of the deep past than almost anywhere else in Britain. Standing among the Neolithic monuments of Orkney, in the Ring of Brodgar, or in the chambered tomb of Maeshowe, or on the extraordinary site of the Ness of Brodgar, where excavations have been underway since 2003, and which appears to have been a ceremonial complex of an ambition and sophistication that nobody predicted before the digging began. You are standing in a place that has been continuously occupied and continuously significant for 5,000 years or more. The Bronze Age followed the Neolithic here. The Iron Age Brox followed the Bronze Age. The Pictish period followed the Iron Age, with Orkney as one of the most intensively settled parts of the Pictish territory, producing symbol stones and high-status metalwork and settlement sites of considerable complexity. And then the Norse came, and Orkney ceased to be Pictish in any meaningful cultural sense, becoming instead one of the most thoroughly Norse places in the British Isles, with a Norse earl, a Norse language that survived until the 15th century as Norn, and a Norse-influenced culture that shaped the island's identity for centuries. What happened to the Pictish people of Orkney when the Norse arrived? The traditional assumption, based partly on the thoroughness of the Norse cultural takeover, was that the indigenous population was substantially displaced or killed, replaced by incoming Norse settlers who simply occupied the empty or cleared landscape. But the genetic evidence, as it has accumulated from ancient DNA studies of Orkney populations, both prehistoric and early historic, is beginning to suggest a more complex picture. While there is clear evidence of a significant Norse genetic contribution to the modern Orkney population, there is also evidence of genetic continuity with pre-Norse populations that suggests the indigenous Orcadians were not simply eliminated, but were in significant numbers absorbed into the Norse-dominated society that replaced the Pictish cultural framework. The Norse settlers who came to Orkney were, in part at least, men and women seeking land and opportunity, and the practical reality of establishing a farming community in a new territory often involves absorbing the existing population rather than eliminating it, particularly when the existing population has knowledge of the landscape and the agricultural practices that the new settlers need to survive. The transformation of Orkney from Pictish to Norse was probably more like the transformation of Pictland into Alba than like an extinction event, a cultural replacement with demographic continuity beneath it. The Norn language of Orkney, which survived as a spoken vernacular until sometime in the 18th century, and as a source of loanwords in the Orcadian dialect of Scots considerably longer than that, is itself evidence of the complexity of the Norse cultural overlay. Norn was a North Germanic language, closely related to Faroese and Icelandic, that developed from the Old Norse, brought to the islands by the settlers of the 9th and 10th centuries, and that maintained itself through the period of Norwegian sovereignty and into the early period of Scottish sovereignty before, finally yielding to Scots under the combined pressures of increased contact with the Scottish mainland, the social prestige of the incoming Scots language, and the declining number of speakers who could maintain the tradition. The last recorded native speaker of Norn died in the 18th century, though specific Norn words and phrases and linguistic features continued to be preserved in the Orcadian dialect for considerably longer. The story of Norn is in some ways a microcosm of the story of Pictish, a language that was once the primary medium of communication for a substantial population that was eventually replaced by a more prestigious alternative, and that left behind only its residue in place names and loanwords and specific lexical items that preserve the trace of its presence without preserving the language itself. Shetland, which lies even further north than Orkney, 40 miles beyond the northern tip of the Orkney group and closer to Bergen in Norway than to Edinburgh, tells a version of the same story with even more pronounced Norse character. The Norse settlers who came to Shetland in the 9th century, or perhaps earlier, seem to have established so complete a cultural dominance that even the place names are almost entirely Norse, with virtually no surviving Pictish or pre-Pictish substrate visible in the toponymy. If there was a Pictish population in Shetland before the Norse arrived, which the archaeological evidence suggests there was, it left almost no linguistic trace in the place names, which is either evidence of a more thorough demographic replacement than occurred in Orkney, or evidence that the Pictish cultural imprint in Shetland was less developed or less pervasive than it was further south, or some combination of both. The archaeology of Shetland in the Pictish period is less thoroughly studied than that of the southern Pictish heartland, and it is possible that future research will reveal a more substantial Pictish presence than is currently visible. But the current evidence suggests that Shetland experienced the Norse transformation in a way that was particularly thorough, leaving a cultural landscape that was more completely Norse than anywhere else in what would eventually become Scotland. The fate of the far north of the mainland, what is now Caithness and Sutherland, follows a similar pattern. Caithness, whose name is Norse rather than Gaelic, meaning headland of the Cath, where Cath is probably a Pictish tribal name, was effectively settled by Norse colonists, to such an extent that by the medieval period the county was Norse-speaking and Norse farming, organised along Scandinavian lines rather than in the ways characteristic of the Gaelic-speaking highlands to its south. The boundary between Caithness and Sutherland, which is itself a Norse name meaning southern land, reflecting the fact that it was south of the Norse heartland in the far north, is a cultural and linguistic boundary that persisted for centuries after the Norse political dominance of the region ended, visible in the different proportions of Norse and Gaelic place names on either side of it. The boundary is not sharp, but it is real, and it reflects the depth of the Norse colonization of the far north during the period following the Viking Age, a depth that was never matched in the areas to the south where the Norse were raiders and overlords rather than settlers in comparable numbers. The Western Isles, as already noted, developed the hybrid Norse-Gaelic culture of the Gaul Gaedhil, but the specific character of that hybrid varied considerably from island to island and from period to period. Lewis and Harris in the north, which are geographically and geologically distinct from the southern islands of the group, show a higher proportion of Norse place names than the southern islands, reflecting a more thorough Norse settlement in the northern part of the chain. Islay in the south, which was the centre of the Dal Riatan kingdom and which maintained a special significance in Gaelic political tradition, retained more of its Gaelic cultural character even through the Norse period, and the great assembly site of Finlagan on Islay, where the later lords of the Isles held their council, may have had earlier ceremonial significance going back to the Dal Riatan period. Another example of the way in which important places maintain their significance across cultural transitions, even when the cultural framework within which they are significant changes entirely. The monasteries of the Western Isles, most of which have left only fragmentary physical traces, were part of the broader Columban network, and were presumably destroyed or disrupted by the Norse raids in the same way that Iona was. But some may have survived in modified form, maintaining a tenuously continuous institutional presence across the period of Norse dominance, and it is possible that the preservation of some early Scottish documentary material in later compilations reflects the work of scriptoria in the Western Isles that maintained their activity even during the most difficult period of the Viking Age. We cannot be certain about this, because the provenance of early Scottish manuscripts is often unclear, and the institutional histories of the monasteries are largely undocumented. But the possibility is worth keeping in mind, because it is one of the ways in which the silence of the 400 years might have been less complete than it appears from the surviving evidence. The connection between the Scottish Gaelic tradition and the Irish Gaelic tradition, which has been a constant theme of the 400 years and which shapes the entire cultural history of the period, is also reflected in the survival of specifically Scottish material in Irish manuscripts and vice versa. The Irish Annals, which are the single most important contemporary source for the history of the 400 years, were compiled in Irish monasteries, but contain substantial information about Scottish events, because the connections between the Irish and Scottish Gaelic-speaking worlds were close enough that events in Scotland were newsworthy to Irish monastic compilers. The Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Tigernach, the Annals of Innisfallen. These Irish compilations preserve references to Scottish battles and the deaths of Scottish kings and the careers of figures who moved between the Irish and Scottish worlds. And they are invaluable for the historian of Scotland precisely because they are not themselves Scottish, because they were compiled in an institutional context that had different biases and different agendas than the later Scottish documentary tradition would have. And because some of what they record was based on earlier documentary sources that no longer survive in their original form. The relationship between the Scottish and Irish church traditions, which was close throughout the 400 years and considerably beyond, also meant that Irish ecclesiastical writers occasionally commented on Scottish affairs in ways that provide information not available from other sources. Bede, writing in Northumbria in the early 8th century, drew on information from both Irish and Pictish sources, and while his perspective was inevitably shaped by his Northumbrian viewpoint and by his specific theological interests, he preserves information about the early Pictish church and about the relationships between the different peoples of northern Britain that is available nowhere else. Adomnan's Life of Columba, written in Iona in the early 8th century, is similarly invaluable despite being hagiographical rather than historical in its primary purpose. The details it preserves about the world of late 6th century Dalriata, the names of individuals and places, the social structures and the political relationships, the texture of daily life in the monastic and aristocratic worlds of the period, are a window into the 400 years that is available nowhere else in comparable detail. Reading these sources requires the same kind of careful attention that reading the symbol stones requires, the same recognition that what you are seeing is always mediated, always shaped by purposes and perspectives and limitations that are not your own and that you have to try to understand in order to make sense of the evidence. Adomnan was writing about Columba 100 years after Columba's death, drawing on oral traditions and earlier written accounts that he processed through his own monastic sensibility and his own understanding of what constituted appropriate hagiographical content. The Columba he presents is a figure of extraordinary miraculous power, performing healings and prophecies and confrontations with supernatural forces in ways that reflect the conventions of the hagiographical genre as much as, or more than, the historical reality of Columba's life. But beneath the hagiographical conventions, there are details of genuine historical value. The names and the places and the political relationships and the social customs that Adomnan takes for granted as background context are often more historically revealing than the miraculous stories that are his primary concern. The archaeology of early medieval Scotland continues to produce new discoveries that modify the historical picture in important ways. The ongoing excavation of sites like the great hill fort of Dunad in Argyll, which was almost certainly the royal centre of the Dalriatan kingdom, has revealed a complex of royal activities including metalworking, feasting, and what appears to have been an inauguration ceremony involving a carved footprint in the rock in which the incoming king placed his foot, a ritual act that connected the king to the land in a way that resonates with what we know from other Celtic traditions about the sacred relationship between kingship and landscape. The Dunad footprint, which is still visible in the rock today, and which visitors can stand in as their predecessors did 1500 years ago, is one of those moments where the distance between the present and the 400 years seems suddenly very small, where the physical trace of a specific human act performed for specific symbolic purposes in a specific place connects directly to something in the present without requiring any interpretation or translation. The Iron Age and early medieval sites of the Inner Hebrides and the mainland coast of Argyll, which were the territory of Dalriata, form one of the densest concentrations of early historic archaeology in Scotland, and the continued work at these sites is filling in the picture of daily life in the Dalriatan kingdom in ways that complement the sparse documentary evidence. The diet of the Dalriatan population, the animals they kept, and the crops they grew, and the fish they caught, and the wild plants they gathered, can be reconstructed with some precision from the zooarchaeological and archaeobotanical evidence from excavated sites. The craft traditions, the pottery, and the metalworking, and the textile production, and the bone working and the woodworking are visible in the material remains. The trade connections, which linked Dalriata to Ireland in the west and to the Pictish kingdoms in the east and to the broader world of the early medieval Atlantic economy, are visible in the distribution of specific types of objects that can be traced to specific sources. This material evidence does not tell us what the Dalriatans thought or felt or believed in the way that a literary tradition would, but it tells us how they lived, what resources they had access to, what relationships they maintained with their neighbours and their environment, how they organised their communities and their labour and their subsistence activities. And in doing so, It gives us a picture of the 400 years that is in some ways more complete and more democratic than a literary tradition would provide, because the material culture of a society reflects the lives of everyone in it, not just the elite whose deeds and thoughts and words are the primary content of most documentary records. The pottery of a Pictish farmstead is evidence of the life of the family that used it, not just of the king who may have ruled the territory. The bones of the animals butchered at a Dalriatan feast are evidence of the skills and the dietary preferences and the agricultural practices of the people who tended those animals, not just of the aristocratic host who commissioned the feast. The 400 years, read through the material evidence, are populated by ordinary people living ordinary lives, and those ordinary lives are, in their own way, as historically significant as the battles and the dynastic marriages and the ecclesiastical politics that dominate the documentary record. The children who grew up in the 400 years are among the most invisible of all the invisible people of the period, and among the most worth trying to see. Children are almost absent from the documentary sources, which were produced by and for adult men in positions of power and authority, and which had very little interest in the experiences of people who had not yet achieved the status that would make them historically visible. They appear occasionally in the hagiographical sources, as subjects of miraculous cures or as the children of important figures whose futures were prophetically announced at their births, but these appearances are formulaic rather than specific, reflecting the conventions of the genre rather than any particular interest in the lives of actual children. The archaeology gives us slightly more to work with. Children's burials, though they are less likely to be elaborately furnished than adult burials, and may have been interred in ways that are less archaeologically visible, occasionally preserve material evidence of the objects that accompanied children in death and that presumably reflect the objects that were important in their lives. A child's gaming piece, a small carved animal, a miniature version of an adult tool. These objects tell us something about the material culture of childhood in the 400 years, about the things that children played with and the skills they were learning to acquire. But they tell us very little about what childhood was like as an experience, how it felt to grow up in a Pictish farming community, or a Dalriatan warrior household, or a monastic school in the Columban tradition, what a child thought about the symbol stones that stood in the fields, or the brocks that dominated the skyline, or the monks who came to the community to preach about a god from a distant land. The women of the 400 years are similarly absent from the documentary record and similarly recoverable, in part, from the material evidence. Women in early medieval Scotland, as in most early medieval European societies, were not the primary producers of the documentary record and appear in it mainly in relation to men, as wives and mothers of important figures, as subjects of legal provisions about property and inheritance, as the occasional abbess or noblewoman whose actions had sufficient political significance to attract notice. The hagiographical tradition includes a small number of female saints, most notably Saint Bridget of Kildare in the Irish tradition, but even these figures are largely constructed through the conventions of sanctity rather than presented as historically specific individuals. What the archaeology tells us about women in the 400 years is limited but not entirely negligible. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains can sometimes reveal information about diet and mobility that has gendered implications, and the craft products associated with women's work, particularly textiles and the tools for processing wool and flax, are occasionally preserved in the archaeological record. The women who spun and wove the cloth used in the communities of the 400 years were performing essential economic functions, and the skill required for high-quality textile production was considerable, involving knowledge of fiber preparation and spinning and weaving techniques that took years to acquire and that were the foundation of a significant portion of the material culture of the period. But we cannot hear their voices, or know their names, or understand how they experienced the world they lived in. These silences within the silence, the absence of children and women and ordinary people from the documentary record of the 400 years, are a reminder that historical recovery is always partial, always shaped by which lives were considered worth recording at the time and which materials survived the subsequent centuries. The 400 years in Scotland are not unusual in this regard. The same biases and the same absences characterize historical records from most periods and most places. What is unusual about the 400 years is the completeness of the textual silence. which means that even the elite documentary record that we would normally have access to is missing, forcing us to work with the material and genetic and toponymic evidence that preserved itself without anyone intending to create a historical record. And this, paradoxically, may give us a slightly less biased picture of the period than we would have if the documentary record had survived, because the material evidence does not systematically exclude women and children and ordinary people in the way that the documentary record does. The pottery and the animal bones and the plant remains from an excavated farmstead speak to the whole community that lived there, not just the men whose names might have appeared in a chronicle entry if the chronicler had thought them worth recording. The modern scientific tools that are transforming our understanding of the 400 years are not replacing traditional historical methods, but augmenting them, adding new kinds of evidence to a picture that was always built from multiple sources. The place name scholars, the Ogham specialists, the students of early Irish and Welsh literature who work to identify traces of Scottish material within those traditions, the experts in early medieval art who analyze the stylistic connections between the Pictish symbol stones and the broader world of Celtic and Germanic decorative art, the numismatists who study the small number of coins and coin-weight objects that turn up in Pictish period contexts and what they tell us about economic connections, the specialists in early medieval law who try to identify Pictish legal elements within the later Scottish legal tradition. All of these scholars are working on different parts of the same puzzle, and the picture they collectively produce is richer and more detailed than any single approach could provide. The challenge for anyone trying to synthesize this work is managing the uncertainty. Every statement about the 400 years that goes beyond the most basic empirical facts has to carry a burden of qualification. We think this was the case. The evidence suggests this interpretation, this hypothesis, fits the available data, but cannot be confirmed with the evidence currently available. This is uncomfortable for anyone who wants a clear and decisive narrative of the period, and it is part of what makes the 400 years feel mysterious rather than simply poorly documented. The mystery is not just a function of the evidence being sparse. It is a function of the evidence being genuinely ambiguous, of the questions being genuinely difficult, of the field being genuinely open in ways that fields with richer documentary records are not. This openness is both the frustration and the attraction of the period. The frustration because it resists the satisfying narrative closure that good history often provides, and the attraction because it invites continued inquiry, because there are still real discoveries to be made, and real debates to be had, and real possibilities of changing the picture in significant ways. The work goes on. At universities in Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Glasgow and St Andrews, scholars are analysing new datasets of ancient DNA from Scottish skeletal collections and finding new patterns in the genetic history of the North. Archaeologists are applying LiDAR surveys to the landscapes of the Pictish heartland and finding settlement sites and field systems that nobody knew existed. Place name scholars are building computational databases of Scottish toponymy that allow new kinds of analysis of the geographic distribution of linguistic elements. Specialists in early medieval art are finding new stylistic connections between the Pictish symbol stones and monuments in distant parts of Europe that suggest more extensive cultural exchange than anyone previously suspected. The picture is changing. The 400 years are becoming more visible, more legible, more real with every passing decade of scholarly attention. What drives this work, beyond the inherent interest of the period and the professional obligations of the scholars involved, is something that is harder to name, but is nonetheless real. The sense that the people of the 400 years deserve to be known, that the effort to understand them is itself a form of respect for what they were and what they created. That history is not just the study of the past, but an ongoing act of recognition, of acknowledging that people who lived before us were as real and as human and as deserving of attention as we are. This is not a fashionable thing to say in some academic contexts, where the emphasis on critical distance and methodological rigor can make any expression of empathy with historical subjects seem naive or unprofessional. But it is nonetheless true, and it is part of what keeps the study of the 400 years alive across the generations, even when the evidence is sparse and the questions are hard and the certainty is minimal. There is a moment in the study of any obscure historical period when you stop thinking of the people as abstractions as the Picts or the Dalriatans or the Britons of Strathclyde, and start thinking of them as individuals, as the person who carved a particular symbol on a particular stone, with particular care and for particular reasons, as the woman who spun the thread that made the tunic that is gone now but was real once, as the child who played in the shadow of a broch and learned the names of the birds and the plants and the stars from someone who had learned them, 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 been doing exactly the same thing for 5,000 years in the same landscape under the same sky. When you reach that moment, the 400 years stop being a problem to be solved and become a presence to be inhabited, a world to be imagined with as much care and as much honesty as the evidence allows, knowing that the imagination will always exceed the evidence, but that the evidence is there to discipline the imagination, to push back against the easy assumptions and the convenient narratives and the temptation to make the past simply a mirror of the present. That is what Scotland's 400 years offer to anyone who spends time with them. Not a solved mystery, but a lived one. Not a completed story, but an ongoing conversation between the present and a past that refuses to be entirely silenced, that speaks through its symbols and its stones and its place names and its genes, that insists on its presence even when it cannot fully articulate what that presence means. The first Scots, whoever exactly they were, and however exactly they came to be what they were, left behind a country that still carries the marks of their having been there, a country whose identity was shaped in those 400 years in ways that are still working themselves out in the present. Scotland is what it is, partly because of what happened in those centuries, and what happened in those centuries is still being discovered, still being argued about, still being revised in the light of new evidence, and new methods, and new questions. The 400 years are not over. They are still happening, in every laboratory where an ancient genome is being sequenced, in every field where a new symbol stone is being found, in every library where a scholar is poring over a manuscript in search of a reference that nobody has noticed before. The silence is not permanent. It is merely incomplete. And the work of making it less incomplete, of giving voice to the people who lived in those centuries and who shaped the country that exists today, is among the most important and most rewarding work that the study of history can do. And here you are, at the end of this long walk through a period that the textbooks barely mention, through a darkness that is less dark than it appears, through a silence that is full of sounds we are still learning to hear. You have spent time with people who left no autobiography, no explanation of themselves, no invitation to be understood, only the stones, the symbols, the names of the places they lived and loved and defended and finally, in some sense, became. If this journey into Scotland's deepest past has given you a sense of the extraordinary human richness that lies behind even the most seemingly empty stretches of history, then it has done what it set out to do. These centuries belong to everyone who has ever wondered where identity comes from, how peoples are made and unmade and remade, why a stone in a field can hold so much more than its weight, why the dead refuse to stay entirely silent, even when they have no words left to speak with. The stones will still be there tomorrow. The symbols will still be waiting to be read more clearly. The genes of the people who carved them are still moving through the world, still making decisions and having children, and occasionally standing in a field in Angus, looking at a carved stone, and feeling something they cannot quite name. But that is, if we are honest about it, the 400 years speaking directly to the present, asking the only question that history ever really asks. Do you know where you come from? Do you know what it cost for you to be here? Do you know the names of the people who stood where you are standing, and who made the world that made you? The answer is never complete. It is never enough. But the asking of it, the determination to keep asking it, even when the answers are partial and provisional and forever in the process of being revised, is itself a form of continuity with those people, a form of fidelity to the human tradition, of trying to understand the past well enough to live in the present, with intelligence and humility and gratitude for what was given and lost and transformed on the way to becoming whatever we are. Now, if tonight this story has kept your mind gently moving through those grey Scottish hills and those carved stones and those silent monasteries and those 400 years of extraordinary human life that left so little and so much behind, then the telling has been worth the effort. You can tap the like button if you feel moved to, not as a grand gesture but as a quiet signal that this kind of slow and careful history is something you want more of. You can subscribe if you want to keep exploring these hidden depths of the human past in the hours when the day has ended and the world has gone quiet, and the mind is ready for something that moves more slowly than the news but carries more weight. Leave a comment if you want. Tell me where you are listening from, what the night looks like where you are, whether there are stars or whether the clouds have covered them. Because this is a conversation across time and distance, and I want to know where the other end of it is. And if this work is something you find valuable and want to support more directly, the membership option is here on YouTube, completely optional, just a way of helping more of these long and serious and unhurried explorations of the past to keep being made. For now, though, you do not need to do anything at all, just let the images settle. The carved stones in their fields, the souterrains running dark beneath the earth, the brocks standing against the northern sky, the monks bent over their manuscripts in the cold scriptoria of Iona and Port Mahomac, the warriors whose names are in the king lists, and whose deeds are in the annals, and whose bones are in the ground of the country they fought over, and whose genes are in the people who are there still. The first Scots, whoever they were, however we eventually learn to name them more precisely, looking at the same sky you are looking at now, the same stars in their courses, the same moon in its cycle, the same darkness before the dawn that comes whether we are ready for it or not. Rest now. The 400 years will still be there in the morning, still waiting to be understood, still speaking in the languages we are still learning, still refusing to be entirely silent, still here. There is a question that sits beneath all of the specific questions about the Picts and the Dalriatans and the Britons and the Norse and the Angles, a question that the 400 years raise in its purest form, and it is this: what makes a people? What is the substance of a collective identity that persists across generations, that survives the loss of political independence and the replacement of language and the transformation of religious practice, that can be extinguished in one form and survive in another, that can be broken into fragments and then reconstituted from those fragments into something that is genuinely continuous with what came before while being genuinely different from it? This is not just a question for historians. It is a question that every human community faces, in one form or another, in every period of history. But it is a question that the 400 years of Scottish history illuminate with unusual clarity, because the transformation of the Pictish and Dalriatan and Brittonic and Anglian populations of the north into the people who would eventually call themselves Scots is one of the most thoroughly studied examples of this kind of collective identity transformation in early medieval history, studied precisely because it happened in a context where the documentary record is sparse enough to force scholars to look at the problem from multiple angles and use multiple kinds of evidence. The answer that the evidence points toward is not a simple one. Collective identities are not simply given by genetics, or by language, or by political affiliation, or by religious tradition, though all of these things contribute to them. They are constructed through the ongoing practices of communities, through the stories that communities tell about themselves, through the ceremonies and the commemorations and the artistic expressions that give shared life a particular shape and meaning, through the landscape that provides a common reference point for people who may differ in many other respects. The Pictish identity that developed over the centuries before the 400 years was constructed in exactly these ways, through the shared practice of erecting symbol stones, through the political structures that gave the Pictish king his authority, through the oral traditions that preserved the shared memory of the community, through the sacred landscape of Pictish territory with its holy hills and its sacred rivers and its ancient monuments that connected the living to the dead and the present to the deep past. When those shared practices were disrupted, when the Pictish king was replaced by the Alba king, and the Pictish oral tradition lost its institutional support, and the Pictish language ceased to be the medium through which those traditions were transmitted, the Pictish identity could not sustain itself. But the people who had held that identity did not disappear. They found other identities, or had other identities offered to them, and found it rational to accept them, and they carried forward into those new identities. Whatever elements of their previous life could be translated into the new framework. The Scottish Gaelic identity that emerged from the 400 years was built partly from the Dalriatan tradition that Columba represented and that the Kingdom of Alba institutionalized, but it was also built from contributions made by all the other peoples of the north, including the Picts, whose aristocratic traditions and legal customs and sacred landscape were incorporated into the new kingdom, even as their specific cultural identity was superseded. The kingdom of Alba was not simply Dalriata enlarged. It was something new, a synthesis of multiple traditions, and its identity was constructed through the ongoing work of the ecclesiastical and poetic and legal specialists who shaped the stories the kingdom told about itself. The genealogies that traced the kings of Alba back through Pictish and Dalriatan ancestry simultaneously were not simply falsifications. They were genuine attempts to construct an identity that could encompass both traditions, that could give the diverse population of the new kingdom a shared past that included their actual ancestors. This is what historians call legitimizing mythology, but that term, with its implication of falseness, understates what was actually being done. The people who constructed those genealogies and those origin narratives were doing the real and necessary work of creating a collective identity for a community that needed one, drawing on the genuine historical materials available to them, but shaping those materials in ways that served the needs of the present rather than simply recording the past. The medieval kingdom of Scotland, which developed from the kingdom of Alba over the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, continued this work of identity construction with increasing sophistication and increasing resources. The development of the cult of St. Andrew as the patron of Scotland, with the corresponding elaboration of the foundation myth of Kinremont as the place where Andrew's relics had come to rest, gave the Scottish Church a claim to apostolic prestige that reinforced its independence from the claims of both Canterbury and York. The development of a specifically Scottish coronation ritual at Scone, centered on the Stone of Destiny, and involving ceremonies whose precise character is not fully documented, but that were clearly designed to connect the incoming king to the land of Scotland in a way that echoed the ancient traditions of sacred kingship that ran through the Celtic cultures of the Atlantic fringe, gave the Scottish monarchy a ceremonial identity that was distinctively its own. The development of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, in which the Scottish nobility asserted their freedom and their allegiance to their king in terms that drew on ideas about the rights of peoples to political self-determination that were highly unusual for their time, gave the Scottish national identity a literary and philosophical expression of remarkable power that continues to resonate today. All of these developments were rooted in the 400 years, in the traditions and the practices and the landscape meanings that those centuries had established as the foundation of what it meant to be Northern and Scottish and distinct. The wars of Scottish independence, fought in the late 13th and early 14th centuries against the claims of the English crown to overlordship of Scotland, were, in some ways, the moment when the identity constructed during and after the 400 years was most severely tested. Edward I of England, who has been called the Hammer of the Scots in recognition of his military success against Scottish resistance, understood that destroying a nation's identity required destroying the physical and institutional foundations of that identity, which is why he seized the Stone of Destiny and the Scottish Royal Archive and attempted to integrate Scotland into an enlarged English kingdom rather than simply imposing military dominance while leaving Scottish institutions intact. The Scottish resistance to this project, led first by William Wallace and then by Robert the Bruce, was not simply military resistance. It was a defense of the collective identity that the 400 years and the subsequent centuries had constructed, a refusal to accept that the Scottish past was simply a prelude to an English future. The Declaration of Arbroath, addressed to the Pope as the arbiter of international legitimacy, made exactly this argument, that the Scottish people had a history and an identity that predated and was independent of any English claim, and that they would continue to defend that history and that identity regardless of what it cost them. The history of Scotland, from the wars of independence to the present, is in important ways the history of the continued negotiation of that identity through the political unions with England, first the Union of Crowns in 1603, and then the Parliamentary Union of 1707, through the Highland clearances, that in the 18th and 19th centuries destroyed the clan system and the Gaelic cultural tradition of the Highlands with brutal efficiency in the name of agricultural improvement, through the massive emigration of Scots to the Americas and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa that scattered the Scottish population around the world, while paradoxically intensifying the attachment to a Scottish identity among the diaspora that was in some cases more romantic and less complicated than the identity of those who remained. All of these developments modified the Scottish identity in significant ways. But they did not dissolve it, and part of the reason they did not dissolve it is that the identity was rooted in something that was sufficiently old and sufficiently deeply embedded in the landscape and the cultural traditions of the country to survive even the most severe pressures. The 400 years provided that deep root. They are the foundation that has made it possible for Scotland to remain Scotland through everything that has happened since. The contemporary resonance of the 400 years is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It is politically and culturally live in ways that make the study of the period genuinely consequential. The Scottish independence movement, which has been one of the defining features of Scottish politics since the late 20th century and which came very close to achieving its goal in the 2014 referendum, is in important ways a movement about the same questions that the 400 years raised. What makes a people? What constitutes a nation? What relationship between past and present justifies a claim to political self-determination? The arguments made in the independence debate, on both sides, drew on historical narratives about Scottish identity and Scottish history that had their roots in the period we have been exploring, in the assertion that Scotland is and always has been a distinct country with its own traditions and its own way of organising its collective life. Whether those assertions are correct in all their details is less important than the fact that they draw on a historical reality that is genuine. Scotland does have a distinct history, and that distinct history does have its origins in the 400 years, in the specific ways in which the peoples of the North worked out their collective life in the period between Roman withdrawal and the emergence of a recognisable national tradition. The Gaelic language, which was the primary language of the Scottish Highland tradition and which is the direct linguistic descendant of the Dal Riatan Gaelic, brought to Argyll from Ireland in the early historic period, is today spoken by only about 60,000 people in Scotland, concentrated primarily in the Outer Hebrides and in scattered communities in other parts of the Highlands and in the cities. This represents a decline of enormous magnitude from the position of Gaelic as the dominant language of the majority of the country that it held in the medieval period, a decline that accelerated dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries under the combined pressures of Highland clearances, emigration, English medium education, and the economic marginalisation of Gaelic-speaking communities. Efforts to revitalise the language, including the establishment of Gaelic medium education, the broadcasting work of the Gaelic language media organisation MG Alba, and various community language planning initiatives, have had some success in stabilising the language among younger generations in some areas, but the long-term trend remains uncertain. The loss of Gaelic in Scotland would be not just a linguistic event, but a cultural catastrophe, the extinction of the tradition that most directly connects contemporary Scotland to the world of the 400 years, the loss of the last living language descended from the speech of the people who established the ecclesiastical and literary traditions that shaped the emerging Scottish identity. The Scots language, which developed from the Northumbrian Anglian dialect of the southeast and which became the primary language of the Scottish lowlands in the medieval period, is in a somewhat different position, recognised by some linguists as a distinct language and by others as a dialect of English, spoken in various forms by a substantial minority of the Scottish population, but without the institutional support and the clearly defined literary tradition that would give it the status of a fully standardised language. Scots occupies a peculiar position in Scottish identity. It is the language of Robert Burns, the national poet, and of a substantial tradition of popular literature and song, but it has never achieved the kind of formal recognition that would allow it to be taught systematically in schools or used in formal administrative contexts. The relationship between Scots and English in Scotland, which has been a source of cultural anxiety since at least the 16th century, reflects the broader tensions of Scottish identity. The negotiation between what is distinctively Scottish and what is shared with or derived from England, the difficulty of asserting cultural distinctiveness without creating an artificial separation from the English-speaking world in which Scotland is economically and socially embedded. The Pictish symbols, which remain the most distinctive and most mysterious of all the residues of the 400 years, have achieved an unexpected contemporary cultural resonance that their creators could never have anticipated. They appear on whiskey bottle labels and on tea towels and on the walls of tourist information centers and on the covers of historical novels. They have been appropriated by the tattoo culture, which is a kind of ironic echo of the ancient suggestion that the Picts were painted or tattooed people, with people choosing to mark their bodies with the double disc and Z rod, or the crescent and V rod, or the mirror and comb, in ways that consciously or unconsciously echo the decorative traditions of a people who are themselves partly defined by their supposed practice of body decoration. They have become, in short, a brand, the visual shorthand for a specifically Scottish, ancient identity that is different from the Celtic knotwork imagery that serves as the visual shorthand for the broader Celtic cultural world, more specific, more local, more genuinely mysterious in a way that the ubiquity of Celtic design has somewhat worn away. This appropriation of Pictish symbols by contemporary Scottish culture is not without its problematic aspects. It tends to flatten the real complexity and real mystery of the symbols into a more comfortable and more marketable form of authenticity. And it risks replacing the genuine scholarly work of trying to understand what the symbols meant with a kind of aesthetic appreciation that is content to admire without seeking to know. But it also represents something real, a recognition, however imperfect and commercialized, that the Picts and their symbols are genuinely worth attending to, that the 400 years produced something of value that the present wants to claim some connection to. The fact that Scottish people and visitors to Scotland are drawn to the symbol stones, that they stop their cars on rural roads to look at them and photograph them and wonder about them, is not a trivial cultural phenomenon. It is an expression of the human need to connect to the past, to find in the landscape the traces of a deeper story than the one that everyday life provides. That need is not going to be satisfied by marketing materials. It requires the harder work of genuine historical and archaeological inquiry. But the existence of the need is itself significant, and the symbol stones, standing in their fields with their carved enigmas, serve as a standing invitation to undertake that harder work. The final thing to say about the 400 years is perhaps the simplest and the most important. They happened. The people who lived in them were as real as we are, as fully human, as complete in their inner lives and their social relationships and their relationship to the landscape they inhabited. The silence that surrounds them is our failure, not theirs, a failure of preservation, a failure of the kind of institutional support that might have maintained their literary and legal and religious traditions in accessible form, a failure of the specific historical circumstances that destroyed the monasteries and disrupted the oral traditions, and replaced the languages and merged the kingdoms in ways that left the earlier cultural layers buried beneath the later ones. But the people were there, and the traces of their presence, in the stones and the genes and the place names and the landscape, are there still. And the work of recovering those traces, of giving back to the first Scots something of the visibility and the voice that history denied them, is work that matters, not just as an academic exercise, but as an act of recognition, of saying to the people of the 400 years what they could not say to themselves. We know you were here. We know you were real. We are still trying to understand what you made and what you were, and what it means that you were here before us. And we are grateful for the traces you left, even the ones we cannot yet read, even the ones that still stand in the fields in the early morning light, speaking in a language that we are still, slowly, beginning to learn. The morning comes to Angus as it has always come, as it came when the carvers were at work on the stones, the light arriving slowly over the low hills to the east, the dew on the grass, the birds beginning, the farm sounds starting, the world resuming its ordinary business. That is also, always, the extraordinary business of being alive in a place that carries all of its own past in its soil, and its names and its faces and its stones. The double disc and the Z-rod wait on the sandstone as they have been waiting for 1500 years. The crescent and the V-rod, the eagle with its accurate eye, the salmon, the mirror, all the symbols we cannot fully read, all the meaning we are still working toward, all the first Scots still speaking from the stone in the only language they have left, which is the language of persistence, of having been here and having left something behind, of being, in some sense that the study of history is always trying to understand more precisely, still here. Walk along the River Erne in Perthshire on any autumn morning when the leaves are coming down and the water is running high, and the hills to the north are showing the first snow on their upper slopes, and you are walking in a landscape that has been continuously inhabited and continuously significant for 5,000 years. The Erne drains the southern highlands through Strathyerne, the wide river valley that was one of the most important centres of Pictish power, and its banks are lined with the evidence of that long habitation. Earthwork forts on the hilltops, souterrains in the fields, the sites of early medieval churches marked by old graveyards with their lichen-covered stones, the names of farms and hamlets that carry their Pictish and Gaelic and Scots syllables into the present. The river itself is older than all of these things. It has been flowing through this landscape since the last glaciers retreated, and it has been used by every human community that has lived here for transport, and for water, and for fish, and for the specific kind of meaning that rivers carry in cultures that have not yet learned to take water for granted. The Pictish royal centre of Forteviot stood somewhere near the confluence of the Erne and the Water of May, and the fragments of carved stone that have been recovered from the area suggest a site of considerable importance, a place where carved stone monument making and ecclesiastical activity combined with royal political functions in a way that parallels what we know of other Pictish royal centres. The precise location of the royal buildings has not yet been identified through excavation, and the site has been subjected to so many centuries of agricultural activity that the surviving physical traces are fragmentary and difficult to interpret. But aerial photography and geophysical survey have revealed the outlines of a complex of structures, enclosures, and possible building footprints, and the crop marks of pits and post holes that speak to a substantial and complex site, whose full character is only beginning to become visible. Here at Forteviot, as at other Pictish royal centres, the 400 years were not empty. They were dense with activity, with the movement of people and goods and information that a royal centre generates, with the political negotiations and the ceremonial performances and the economic transactions that constitute the daily life of a political capital, however small and however different from the capitals of later states. The royal inauguration site at Scone, which Kenneth MacAlpin chose as the ceremonial centre of the new Kingdom of Alba, and which remained the coronation site of Scottish kings until the reign of Charles II in 1651, is 2 miles north of Perth at a point where the River Tay begins to broaden into its lower reaches. The Moot Hill at Scone, where the inauguration ceremonies were conducted, is an artificial mound whose origins are disputed, but which may have been constructed as a ceremonial focal point in the Pictish period, or possibly even earlier. The practice of inaugurating kings on artificial mounds, which appears in multiple early medieval contexts, including the inaugural mound at Tara in Ireland, where the High Kings of Ireland were proclaimed, and the thing sites of the Norse world where legal and political assemblies were held on raised ground, is one of those widespread practices that speak to a shared understanding across multiple cultures of the relationship between elevation, visibility, and political legitimacy. The king who stood on the Moot Hill at Scone could be seen by everyone gathered for the inauguration. His elevation above the crowd was a physical expression of his political elevation above the community, and the connection of the ceremony to a particular place in a particular landscape bound the king to the territory he was claiming to rule in a way that an abstract legal formula could not replicate. The Stone of Destiny, whose history is one of the more complex and contested threads in the entire story of the 400 years and their legacy, was the physical object on which the inaugural ceremony at Scone centred, the seat of the incoming king, the stone that connected the ceremony to the long history of Scottish kingship, and through that history to the deepest roots of Scottish identity. Its origins are genuinely obscure. The tradition that it was the stone on which Jacob slept at Bethel, carried from the Holy Land through Egypt to Ireland and then to Scotland, is clearly legendary. The alternative tradition that it was an ancient stone of Pictish, or even earlier Scottish sacred significance, used in inauguration ceremonies at Dunad or at some other early Dal Riatan royal centre before being transferred to Scone by Kenneth or one of his successors, is more plausible but cannot be confirmed from the surviving evidence. The physical description of the stone that was seized by Edward I in 1296, a plain rectangular block of sandstone, fits the geology of the Perthshire area but does not match the descriptions of a more elaborate and more portable sacred stone that appear in some earlier sources, leading to a persistent tradition that the monks of Scone hid the real stone of destiny before Edward arrived and substituted a plain stone for him to take, and that the real stone is still hidden somewhere in Scotland, perhaps in the foundations of Dunsinane Hill, or in a cave somewhere in the Highlands. This tradition is probably just that, a tradition, a story generated by the desire to preserve the sacredness of a national symbol in the face of its physical loss. But it is not entirely impossible, and the fact that it persists in popular consciousness is itself evidence of how deeply the Stone of Destiny is embedded in the Scottish understanding of what national identity means and requires. The return of the Stone of Destiny to Scotland in 1996, when the British government agreed to its repatriation to Edinburgh under an arrangement that provides for its return to Westminster for coronation ceremonies, was a significant political and cultural event whose symbolism was widely understood and widely felt. Whatever the physical object returned to Edinburgh is or is not, the act of return was an acknowledgement that the seizure of 1,296 had been an act of cultural aggression, that the stone's presence in Westminster had been a symbol of subordination, and that the political relationship between Scotland and the rest of Britain had changed enough to make the perpetuation of that symbol inappropriate. The stone now rests in Edinburgh Castle, visible to the hundreds of thousands of people who visit the castle each year, and it will return to Westminster for the next coronation and then come back to Edinburgh, a shuttling back and forth that is itself a symbol of the complex political relationship between Scotland and the rest of Britain that the 400 years helped to create and that continues to be negotiated in the present. The hills of Scotland remember everything. Dunsinane, where Macbeth made his last stand in the play that is not quite history, stands in the Sidlaw Hills northeast of Perth, a prominent summit visible from a great distance. Its association with the most famous Scottish figure in all of English literature, reinforced by the peculiar way in which Shakespeare's treatment of the Macbeth story, drawn from the Tudor historian Holinshed, has become more famous and more influential than the actual history of Macbeth Mac Finlech, who was a real king of Scotland in the 11th century, a man who killed his predecessor Duncan in battle, rather than in his bed, and who ruled Scotland for 17 years before being killed in his turn by the future Malcolm III, who was the king whose descendants would rule Scotland through the medieval period, and who established the dynasty that completed the transition from the world of the 400 years to the recognizable medieval kingdom. Macbeth, the historical figure, is a product of the world that the 400 years made. A Gaelic-speaking king, with connections to both the northern and the southern parts of the country, exercising power in a political system that was still shaped by the fusion of Pictish and Dalriatan traditions that Kenneth MacAlpin had set in motion 2 centuries earlier. Macbeth, the Shakespeare character, is a different kind of product, a meditation on power and guilt and the supernatural that uses a Scottish historical setting as a stage for universal human concerns. The gap between the two Macbeths is a measure of how much interpretation and imagination and political purpose has been layered over the 400 years and their immediate aftermath by the centuries that followed. The cairns on the hilltops of Scotland, the simple piles of stones that mark summits and passes, and the sites of old battles and burials, are among the most persistent and most widely distributed of all the physical residues of the human past in this landscape. They have been added to, generation after generation, by walkers who placed a stone on the pile as they passed, continuing a practice of communal memorial that goes back far further than anyone knows. The cairn at the top of Shealion, the mountain in Highland Perthshire whose name means Fairy Hill of the Caledonians, preserves, in its Gaelic name, a reference to the pre-Christian spiritual landscape of the Highland region, and the act of adding a stone to its summit cairn is an act of participation in a tradition of landscape engagement that connects the present moment to the deep past, in a way that requires no historical knowledge to be meaningful, and that is more powerful for being largely unconscious. People add stones to cairns because it feels right, because the tradition is there, and joining it costs nothing and is a pleasant way of marking one's presence in a significant place. The 400 years are full of such moments. Moments when the weight of practice, of doing what has always been done in a particular place, carries the past forward into the present, without requiring anyone to make a deliberate decision to preserve it. This is perhaps the most important thing that the 400 years can teach us about how cultures and identities actually persist across time, not primarily through the deliberate acts of preservation that historians tend to focus on. The writing down of texts and the construction of monuments and the compilation of archives, but through the unconscious continuation of practices that are embedded so deeply in the life of a community that they continue even when the community no longer remembers where they came from or what they originally meant. The holy wells, and the seasonal celebrations, and the landscape practices, and the oral traditions that survived the 400 years, and everything since, did not survive because anyone decided they should survive. They survived because they served real functions in the lives of the communities that practiced them, because they provided meaning and cohesion, and a relationship with the landscape that was not replaceable by anything the incoming cultural traditions offered. The 400 years are a testament to the resilience of embedded cultural practice, to the way in which human communities find ways to carry their deepest commitments forward, even through the most severe disruptions, in forms that may be modified beyond recognition, but that maintain some thread of continuity with what came before. And so the first Scots, whoever they were, wherever exactly the boundary of that identity should be drawn, left behind a country that is still shaped by their presence, still carrying the marks of their work in the landscape and the language and the culture and the genetic ancestry of its people. Scotland is not simply a political entity that happens to occupy a particular territory. It is the accumulation of everything that has happened in that territory over 10,000 years of human habitation, and the 400 years are the crucible in which the most essential elements of its distinctive identity were formed. To understand Scotland is to understand the 400 years, imperfectly and partially as that understanding must always be, but with enough clarity to see the deep roots of the distinctive culture that has persisted here against considerable odds, to hear the voices of the people who made that culture in the traces they left behind, and to feel the weight of what those centuries mean for everything that has come after them. The symbol stones are not decorative, the brocks are not ruins, the place names are not accidents. They are the testimony of a people who were here, who were real, who mattered, and who continue to matter in ways that the best scholarship and the most attentive archaeology and the most careful listening to what the landscape has to say are still working to fully understand. The 400 years of silence are not silent at all, if you know how to listen, and learning to listen is always worth the effort. Consider one more thing before you let the images settle and the words dissolve into the particular quality of attention that lies between wakefulness and sleep. The study of the 400 years is not the study of a finished thing. It is the study of a process that is still unfolding, because the transformation of diverse peoples into a single nation, with a shared sense of who they are and where they come from and what distinguishes them from their neighbors, is never actually finished. Every generation inherits the work of the previous generations and adds to it and modifies it and passes it forward in a form that is both continuous and new. The Scots who are living in Scotland today are inheriting the work of the 400 years in this sense. They are living within a cultural and political identity that was shaped in those centuries, that carries the marks of the Pictish and the Gaelic and the Brittonic and the Norse and the Anglian influences that went into its making, that expresses itself in landscapes and languages and institutions whose roots go back into the period that this exploration has tried to illuminate. And they are adding to that inheritance their own layer of experience and interpretation and decision, their own choices about what to preserve and what to transform and what to let go, their own negotiations with the pressures of the present and the claims of the past. This is what it means to be a people. This is what it means to have a history. The 400 years are not a closed chapter. They are an open question, still being answered, still being lived. Think of the children in Scotland today who are learning Gaelic in school, who are being given access to a tradition that connects them, however indirectly and however imperfectly, to the world of Columba and the Dalriatan missionaries, and the 600 years of Gaelic cultural fluorescence in the north that the Columban Church made possible. Think of the archaeologists who are out in the fields of Angus and Aberdeenshire, with their ground-penetrating radar and their trowels and their sample bags, patiently recovering the physical traces of a world that has been underground for 1,500 years, Think of the geneticists who are sequencing ancient genomes from skeletal collections and finding in those sequences the record of migrations and mixtures and separations that no document preserves. Think of the place name scholars building their databases, and the linguists working on the Ogham inscriptions, and the art historians analyzing the stylistic connections between the Pictish symbol stones and the wider world of early, medieval decorative art. All of this work is the 400 years still being made, still being recovered, still being added to the record that the people of those centuries left incomplete. And the fact that you have spent this time with the story of those centuries, that you have brought your attention and your imagination to a period that most people never think about, is itself a contribution to the ongoing process of making those years less silent and less invisible than they would otherwise be. History requires witnesses. The 400 years have found in you a witness who is still listening, still trying to understand, still attending to the traces that the first Scots left behind when they lived and worked and carved their symbols and built their brocks and crossed their narrow seas and named their rivers and raised their children in the landscape that they made their own, and that, in some sense, they could never have imagined, and that we are still working to understand, remains their own to this day. Sleep well. The morning will come, as it has always come, the light arriving over the low hills, the dew on the grass, the birds beginning their particular conversation with the day, the carved stones standing in their fields, as they have been standing for 1,500 years, patient, persistent, present, still speaking in the language we are still learning, still here. There is one more thread worth pulling at, one more layer of the 400 years that resists easy summary and that deserves a few more minutes of careful attention. It is the thread of what might be called the underground continuity, the ways in which the deepest practices and the deepest beliefs of the people of the 400 years survived not in any institutional form, but in the everyday life of communities that went on living in the same places and doing the same kinds of things that their ancestors had done, long after the political and cultural frameworks that originally gave those practices their explicit meaning had been replaced by something else entirely. Every anthropologist and every folklorist who has worked in the Scottish countryside has encountered this underground continuity in one form or another. The persistence of well-dressing practices at holy wells that are officially the wells of Christian saints, but whose pattern of ritual attention clearly predates any Christian association. The survival into the 20th century, in some remote Highland communities, of beliefs about the nature of time and the structure of the spiritual world that have no obvious Christian origin and that echo the patterns of pre-Christian, Celtic cosmological thought, the continuation of seasonal agricultural rituals that attach themselves to Christian festival dates, but whose core logic is clearly older than Christianity and belongs to a world in which the turning of the seasons was a matter of deep communal and spiritual concern rather than simply a practical agricultural calendar. These survivals are not evidence of pagan survival in any simple sense. The people who maintained them were genuinely Christian, integrated into the Christian community of their parishes, participating in the sacramental life of the church. But they were also people embedded in a landscape that was saturated with older meanings, and they had learned from their parents and grandparents to be attentive to those meanings in ways that the official Christianity of the period did not always encourage and sometimes actively discouraged. The underground continuity of the 400 years is in this sense one of the most extraordinary things about them, the way in which the practices and the beliefs and the landscape relationships of a pre-Christian world found ways to survive the imposition of a new religious framework, not through deliberate resistance or conscious preservation, but through the simple, stubborn persistence of what was embedded in how people lived in specific places and what those places meant to them. The 400 years speak. The 400 years speak.